Chapter 897. After a few days on the Bridge of Times, Luo Fan came to a mysterious space-time. He looked down at the four mysterious beings that seemed to be the azure dragon, the white tiger, the vermilion bird, and the black tortoise, and his face showed that he had expected it. The will of the four living beings below were none other than the image formed by the will of the world projected by the four spirits era. Although the four mysterious beings were huge, they were only hundreds of thousands of meters tall. Compared to the 6,667th level, which was the projection of the world's will of the era of giant gods, they were billions of times smaller. Combined with the names of the two levels, Luo Fan instantly determined that the appearance of the world's will of the world should be in line with the characteristics of this era, and not determined by other factors as he had previously thought. In other words, it was precisely because that era was the era of giant gods that the projection of the world's will of the world would be the image of a giant that could only be described in light years. At this moment, the projection of the world's will of the era of four spirits was not in the shape of a human, but in the shape of the four spirits. With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand, and the seal of destruction that he had used to deal with the projection of the world's will of the era of giant gods appeared out of thin air. It split into four and pressed down, blasting into the heads of the azure dragon, white tiger, vermilion bird, and black tortoise. Just like how it faced the projection of the world's will of the era of giant gods, it constantly destroyed the projection of the world's will of the era of four spirits. Although the projection of the world's will of the era of four spirits was far inferior to the projection of the world's will of the era of giant gods in terms of size, the strength of the projection of the world's will of the world did not depend on its size, but the degree of reality of the projections of the two eras. The more realistic the projection of the eras, the more powerful the projection of the world's will of the world. In contrast, instead, the projection of the era of four spirits was more realistic than the projection of the era of giant gods. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that the projection of the world's will of the era of four spirits was more powerful than the projection of the world's will of the era of giant gods. It was obviously not that simple for Luo Fan to destroy the projection of the world's will of the era of four spirits. The time needed was unlikely to be comparable to the projection of the will of the world from the age of the giant gods. That was why Luo Fan was rather reassured. After the square seal had been imprinted into the heads of the four spirits, he landed on the seal that had been imprinted into the azure dragon's head. His perception cut into the projection of the world's will below, and once again began the final process of the age of giant gods. He began to comprehend the mysteries of the projected will of the world. During this process, the four spirits did not struggle at all. Instead, they resisted in various ways, wanting to destroy the seal and Luo Fan, who was on top of the seal. However, the four spirits were formed by the will of the heavens and earth. When faced with the destruction seal that contained pure destruction might, the will of the heavens and earth resisted. There was no effect at all. It could only be as futile as the resistance of the will of the world projected by the age of the giant gods, allowing Luo Fan to take whatever he wanted from it. Such a situation was already within Luo Fan's expectations. After the projection of the age of the giant gods, he already had some understanding of the projection of the world's will. He already knew that it was just a trick. Naturally, he was not surprised or worried. Of course, this did not mean that it would be easy for Luo Fan to pass through the hurdles of the projection of the world. In fact, the difficulty of passing through the hurdles of the projection of the era was not facing the projection of the world's will at the end. Instead, it was how to find this space-time amidst the various projection of the world's will and where the projection of the world's will was located. Similarly, it took a year. Luo Fan had just obtained all the mysteries contained in the projection of the world's will of the age of the four spirits. This allowed his cultivation realm to rise slightly. While the realm of void comprehension became more stable, it also gave him a deeper understanding of the projection of the world's will. He had a better understanding of the possible reactions of the projection of the world to all kinds of accidents. At this moment, it was also the moment when the projection of the world's will was about to be completely erased by the destruction seal. Faced with such a situation, he naturally wouldn't hold back. He shook the square seal. As the projection of the world's will was destroyed, the projection of the entire age of the four spirits was also destroyed. The information backlash of the projection of the world's information instantly descended, allowing Luo Fan to gain some new gains. He had a better understanding of the realm of void comprehension. The projection of the age of the four spirits was different from the projection of the age of the giant gods. He had experienced a year in that strange space-time, but the projection of the age of the four spirits had experienced several months. It was not as short as the age of the giant gods. This made Luo Fan feel quite fortunate. However, it was just a slight sigh. After the sigh, he once again devoted himself to the process of breaking through the hurdles wholeheartedly. As Luo Fan worked hard to break through the hurdles, time gradually passed. In a trance, 5 years had passed. In these 5 years, Luo Fan had passed through more than 2,000 hurdles. Unknowingly, he had already reached the 9,000th hurdle. These more than 2,000 checkpoints took him 3 to 4 months on average to complete each checkpoint. Although it was not out of his expectations, it was not a pleasant surprise either. Of course, not every hurdle had taken him such a long time. On the contrary, some of the hurdles had taken him far more than 3 to 4 months, and even years or decades. However, some of the hurdles had only taken him a few days or even a few hours to pass. The reason for such a great disparity was none other than the difference in the flow of time between the projection of the world's will and the real space-time. For some of the era's projections, the disparity was extremely huge. Even 1,000 years was only a few breaths or a few moments in real time. However, for some of the era's projections, the disparity was not huge. At most, it was a difference of a few times. In other words, 1,000 years would take at least a few decades, or even a few years, for Luo Fan to fully obtain all the benefits of each projection of the world's will. The time needed was relatively fixed. In fact, as the hurdles got further and further, the time needed would get longer and longer. Among them, at the very least, it would take as long as a few years. Under such circumstances, he could already be considered extremely lucky to be able to pass through one hurdle in an average of 3 to 4 months. The speed at which he passed the hurdles was extremely fast. The 9,000th level was a projection of more than 3,000 eras before the end of days, an era known as the Age of Steel. This era's projection was considered a special era among the thousands of era's projections that Luo Fan had seen in the past. This was because the vast majority of intelligent beings in this era were steel-type intelligent beings. Or rather, the vast majority of intelligent beings. They were all silicon-based life forms. They were similar to robots, but they were completely natural and had no traces of man-made existence. This kind of life form's evolution method was extremely mysterious. It was a kind of evolution method that was similar to technological modification of oneself. This kind of evolution method allowed these silicon-based life forms to be almost infinitely powerful and have almost limitless possibilities. In the end, the most powerful life form in this era was a being at the peak of the void enlightening stage. It was even faintly approaching the Tao integration stage. However, although this being was powerful, it had the appearance of a huge planet. Its mobility and combat ability were greatly restricted. Because of this, Luo Fan did not fall into a disadvantageous position in the face of that being. Instead, he used the various mysterious abilities that he had comprehended after passing the previous 2,000 hurdles to forcefully grind this being to death. Due to the characteristics of the Iron Age, this being's tentacles almost covered the entire Earth's universe. The destruction of this being caused the entire Earth's universe to shake violently. It was almost uncontrollably transforming in the direction of destruction. It was also because of this that the will of the Iron Age's projection of the heaven and earth had to take action personally. It condensed the boundless power of the will of the heaven and earth, condensed the boundless power of the Iron Age, and transformed into a giant hand that descended from the void to crush Luo Fan into powder. This was an opportunity that Luo Fan seized. Through the way that giant hand appeared, he found the location of the will of the heaven and earth, and thus crossed the void to arrive at this strange space-time where he was at this moment. However, as soon as he stepped into this space-time, Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. This was because this space-time was different from any of the 2,000 or so hurdles he had seen in the past, starting from the 6,668th hurdle. This space-time was not the kind of void where there was only the mysterious projection of the will of the heaven and earth that contained the mysterious characteristics of this era. Instead, it was the exact opposite. The entire space-time was like an extremely complete universe. It seemed even more real than the real Earth's universe and the projection of the Iron Age that Luo Fan had stayed in previously. It was even more like a real universe. The endless planets that flickered with a metallic luster hung in the space-time. The stars that emitted an endless metallic luster, and the boundless void that flickered with a metallic luster seemed to be an extremely complete and mysterious universe. At this moment, the moment Luo Fan stepped into this universe, countless huge silicon-based life forms that were at the void comprehending level charge toward Luo Fan from all directions. These silicon-based life forms varied in size. The big ones were like stars, while the small ones were like ants. Their eyes shone with all sorts of strange glows like robots that were frantically calculating something. The eyes of all the endless silicon-based life forms shone with the same light at the same time, and they could not help but produce an extremely strange pressure that made Luo Fan's heart skip a beat. Regardless of the size of these life forms, their strength and aura were all at least at the void comprehending level. The methods used by each life form were what Luo Fan had comprehended from the Iron Age projection. They were extremely mysterious techniques that had existed in the history of the Iron Age and could greatly unleash the destructive power of silicon-based life forms. It could be said that if the trajectory life form could take a look at the attacks of these countless silicon-based life forms at this moment, it would definitely be able to comprehend countless wondrous techniques, allowing it to unleash its strength beyond its level. However, if the silicon-based life forms were to witness this scene, what awaited them would no longer be a matter of comprehending the wondrous techniques to unleash their strength beyond their level. Instead, it would be a matter of whether they could maintain their autonomy in the midst of these attacks, and whether they could escape from the countless attacks. Luo Fan had passed the more than 2,000 checkpoints and the more than 2,000 era projections. At this moment, his realm had already made great progress. Although he still had not reached the peak of the void comprehending realm, he was no longer just stabilizing the void comprehending realm like before. If each realm was divided into 4 minor realms, achievement, minor achievement, great achievement, and perfection, then right now Luo Fan was at the great achievement realm of the void comprehending realm. He was still a long way from perfection, but he was already many times stronger than before, with the support of such a realm. At this moment, Luo Fan did not panic or despair in the face of the endless attacks from the silicon-based life forms at the void comprehending realm. Instead, he was filled with endless fighting spirit. I didn't expect the will of the world to have such changes. Seems like this stage is also a rather special stage on the entire path. Perhaps it's as special as the 3,333rd and 6,666 stages. This thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Based on what he had seen and analyzed over 2,000 projected wills of the world, under normal circumstances, the projected wills of the world from the Iron Age would definitely not be like this. It was more likely that it was just like the projected wills of the world from the previous eras. Without any concealment, he allowed himself to be slaughtered and taken as he pleased. With such a change, he could actually unleash a combat power that was countless times stronger than the projected wills of the Iron Age. This was absolutely unreasonable. For the path of Tao integration or the path of transcendence, This unreasonableness meant that there might be changes in the subsequent stages. It just so happens to be the 9,000th stage. It seems that this path is really not just the path of Tao integration, but the path of transcendence. When he thought that this stage might be a special stage, this thought naturally appeared in his mind, causing him to faintly feel even more anticipation. At the same time, a deeper fear was born in the depths of his heart. He looked forward to it. The reason was naturally very simple. After all, if this path was the path of transcendence, it meant that if he could reach the end of this path, he might obtain even more benefits, and he might even be able to pursue the transcendence realm above the convergence realm. No matter what the Almighties behind this path were thinking or scheming, such benefits were real, and he could not help but look forward to it. The reason for this fear was not complicated. If it was the path of Tao integration, it proved that the mighty figure was an existence beyond the Tao integration. It could be a transcendent. It could also be a Tao master or even a sage. But if it was the path of transcendence, it proved that the mighty figure was definitely an existence beyond the transcendent. It could only be a Tao master or a sage, not a transcendent. And this meant that the mighty figure behind this path was more powerful than he had previously thought, and his schemes might be more profound. How could he not feel more afraid? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, his movements did not slow down at all. The power in his body trembled slightly, and then dozens of combinations of power containing tens of thousands of kinds of power rushed out of his acupuncture points. In an instant, dozens of human shadows were condensed in front of him. These human shadows looked a little illusory, as if they could collapse and disappear with a gust of wind. But the aura they exuded was extremely powerful, extremely vast, and extremely pure. The aura had reached the level of the consummation of the void understanding realm, and even faintly had the aura of the Tao integration realm. It seemed to be on the verge of the Tao integration realm, and its purity was the purest destruction. They were the products of the destructive seal that Luo Fan had modified over the years due to the improvement of his cultivation realm. In terms of power alone, this change did not increase the destructive power contained in it much. It was still the same as before. However, this modification and change allowed this power combination to possess something that the seal of destruction originally didn't have. It was an extremely fundamental and instinctive battle spirit. This spirituality was not like the treasure spirit of a magic treasure, which could give this combination of power, wisdom, and other things besides self. But it allowed this combination of power to perfectly exert its power, so that the destructive power of this combination of power could be used in the most appropriate and exquisite way in the battle. Thus, it did not need to waste much of Luo Fan's thoughts. As long as it was used, it could naturally fight with the opponent, and in the end, either the opponent or itself was destroyed. After this change, this combination of power could no longer be called the destructive seal. It could only be called the destroyers. As soon as these dozens of destroyers appeared, each of them erupted with shocking power. Their bodies either enlarged or shrank, and in an instant, they adjusted their bodies to a size that was most suitable for fighting with the opponent. They directly fought with the countless silicon-based life forms at the void understanding realm. These destroyers possessed an instinctive battle spirit. Their destructive power was unleashed in an unimaginably exquisite manner. With just a single touch, it had already blotted out the sky and covered the earth. The endless waves of silicon-based life forms were completely contained. All silicon-based life forms that were beyond their protective circle were directly destroyed by the exquisite destructive power they unleashed. They could not get close to Luo Fan at all. Welcome. Chapter 898. Although the silicon-based life forms were almost endless, covering the sky and covering the earth, Luo Fan was only the size of an ordinary person after all. No matter how many silicon-based life forms there was only a limited number of them that could get close to Luo Fan. The several dozen destroyers were countless times fewer than the silicon-based life forms, but when they formed a circle, it was enough to guard Luo Fan tightly from all directions, blocking the attacks from the countless silicon-based life forms on Luo Fan. Luo Fan hovered in the air, his expression extremely calm as he carefully observed this space-time. This space-time seemed completely different from the strange space-time in the projections of over 2,000 eras that he had encountered before, but there was not much difference in essence. After all, they were all his junior brothers. The places where the wills of the universe existed were essentially places where time and space seemed rather illusory. The reason why it was completely different from the similar space-time projections of the thousands of years that he had encountered before was because it definitely contained mysteries that Luo Fan had never understood before. This meant that if he could comprehend the mysteries of this space-time clearly, he would definitely be able to gain more benefits and comprehend more things that he had never comprehended before. The fortuitous encounter for the great perfection of the void comprehending stage might lie in this. Such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The void comprehending stage was divided by Luo Fan into 4 stages: achievement, minor achievement, great achievement, and perfection. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had gone through over 2,000 stages, had already stepped onto the 3rd stage of these 4 stages, which was the great achievement stage. However, because the span of the void comprehending stage was extremely huge, it was still far from reaching great perfection. If he cultivated normally, perhaps he would need millions or millions of years to reach it. However, judging from the extent of the space-time that he could not understand, the mysteries contained within were at least at the peak of the void comprehending stage or above. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally had reason to believe that comprehending the mysteries contained within would allow him to achieve a breakthrough in his realm, allowing him to attain a realm that would normally take millions or millions of years. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan could not help but be filled with an indescribable fighting spirit. He spread his senses, which had been tempered once again, as far as the eye could see. He spread out towards this strange space-time, observing everything in this space-time in detail, comprehending all the mysteries behind it. The projection of this era was a projection of the Steel Era. Based on his past experience, the projection of the world's will was definitely related to the word steel. It could even be said that the name of the Age of Steel was due to this projection of the will of the world. The ubiquitous metallic luster in the void of this boundless universe was the external manifestation of this essence. When Luo Fan's perception, which had already undergone all sorts of changes and possessed all sorts of inconceivable and wondrous effects, came into contact with this world, a solemn, firm, and indestructible feeling emerged. In an instant, it was transmitted into his mind through this perception, causing him to instantly feel as if there were countless pieces of information flowing through his mind in an instant. In that instant, Luo Fan understood the truth of this space-time. This space-time, it was the projection of the world's will itself, or rather, the projection of the world's will had completely fused with the strange space-time that carried the will of the world in the other trials. Under such circumstances, this space-time could be said to be the projection of the world's will, and the projection of the world's will could also be said to be the space-time. The difference between the two had been weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. As such, Luo Fan released his perception at this moment. He could sense the various mysteries of space-time from afar. It was just like when he had directly sent his perception into the projection of the world's will at the other checkpoints. The various gains he had obtained were the same gains he had obtained when he had sent his perception into the projection of the world's will. However, this did not mean that it was easy for him to sense the mysteries of this projection of the world. Instead, it was the exact opposite. The difficulty had instead increased by who knew how many times. This was because even though he could directly sense the various things that needed to be suppressed by the projected will of the world before he could sense them, the things he sensed were formed after going through all sorts of unbelievable changes and indescribable changes. It could be said that although they were all the same mysteries, what he had sensed in the past was like a textbook that he could not wait to completely understand after reading it. At this moment, however, It was as if he could not wait to stuff the principles within into the gaps of the book. The difference in difficulty between the two was obvious. It really isn't that simple. Luo Fan sighed slightly, but he was not discouraged. If it was so easy to understand the various mysteries within, how could the space-time in front of him give birth to the endless silicon-based life forms that were attacking him at this moment? With a thought, he did not directly analyze the information transmitted through his perception. Instead, he observed the entire space-time, comprehending the mysteries of the structure of this space-time and deducing the key to this space-time. Just like the projection of the era and the projection of the forbidden lands that he had encountered before, this space-time also had a key and a core. As long as he could find that key and core, it would be 1,000,000 times easier to destroy this space-time or comprehend the various mysteries of the space-time. In contrast, finding the key to the core of this space-time could be said to be like sharpening a knife to cut firewood. If he directly comprehended the various information he had obtained from the surrounding void, it would definitely allow Luo Fan to completely comprehend the various mysteries of this space-time, as well as the various mysteries contained in the projection of the world's will of the Iron Age. In the end, it would allow him to make crucial progress and break through the greater mastery of void comprehension to the great perfection of void comprehension. However, the time and energy needed to do so would be countless times more than the time and energy needed to find the key to the core of this space-time. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan not know how to choose? This space-time was not a real universe, and the way the stars and planets existed and operated did not exist according to the way of the real universe. However, since it could exist so perfectly and stably, the way the stars and planets existed and operated naturally had certain rules. Such rules might be extremely complicated. Perhaps it was extremely obscure, but it was something that could be obtained by observing with one's eyes and not something that could only be obtained through meticulous perception. Such a process was naturally not simple, and Luo Fan did not expect to see through the mysteries within at a glance. That was why he was not anxious at all. Hovering in the void, he allowed the destroyers he sent out to fight against the endless silicon-based life forms around him. He only paid attention to the stars and planets in the entire space-time, observing their orbits and how they affected each other. Those destroyers had extremely instinctive combat spirituality and could unleash the destructive power of the combination of powers to the limit. Moreover, they had Luo Fan as their backer, supporting their consumption of power. They were able to sustain their energy consumption, but they were not afraid of the countless silicon-based life forms around them that were growing in number and strength. Even if these silicon-based life forms were existences equivalent to the void comprehending realm, it was the same. The destroyers firmly guarded the boundary of thousands of kilometers around Luo Fan. Every time they raised a hand or moved a foot, several silicon-based life forms would turn into powder. They even directly shattered the power that the space-time bestowed upon the silicon-based life forms into the most fundamental power particles, causing the space-time to instantly lose a huge amount of power. Throughout the entire process, although the techniques used by the destroyers did not contain much of the Great Tao, they were extremely practical. However, it was extremely practical. Every single action could be said to be the most perfect move that could unleash the destruction power to the greatest extent in all the situations it had encountered at that time. Under their efforts, the space within 1,000 kilometers around Luo Fan was still empty, but beyond this 1,000 kilometers, it was gradually enveloped by a metallic mist. Moreover, this mist, as the destroyers moved, the aura became thicker and more obvious. Dozens of days later, the mist had become so thick that it was almost tangible, spreading out like a huge, thick metal sphere that enveloped Luo Fan and the dozens of destroyers within. This mist was not something else. It was the remnants of the silicon-based life forms that had been destroyed by the destroyers. Each of the silicon-based life forms was tens of thousands of meters tall, like a mountain. After they were destroyed, the remnants were only the size of a strand of hair. Under such circumstances and with such thick mist existing, one could imagine how many silicon-based life forms had been completely destroyed by the destroyers. If the specific number was calculated, it would perhaps be an astronomical figure. However, it was meaningless, as no one would be so bored as to calculate the specific number. Because at this moment, the silicon-based life forms that had appeared out of thin air from all over the space-time and appeared in the surroundings and were madly charging towards Luo Fan's location were still endless, densely packed, and seemingly endless. At a glance, the silicon-based life forms had even spread over tens of millions of kilometers, forming a huge, densely packed sphere of silicon-based life forms that enveloped Luo Fan and the dozens of destroyers, constantly unleashing various exquisite attacks that could instantly destroy any void comprehending stage being from any other location. The situation seemed no different from dozens of days ago. However, there was not a hint of worry on Luo Fan's face, nor was there a hint of impatience. Instead, he unknowingly wore a faint smile, as if the various vile scenes before him did not pose any threat to him, and the seemingly never-ending attacks did not pressure him at all. In reality, that was indeed the case. To him, the endless silicon-based life forms of the void-comprehending realm posed no threat to him at all. While the destroyers had boundless might and boundless combat intelligence, seemingly no different from true cultivators, they were merely a combination of powers that Luo Fan had unleashed. However, they were only a combination of Luo Fan's power. It could be said that it was just a kind of divine ability. As long as they had enough power, they could fight forever and would not tire and make mistakes like cultivators. Under such circumstances, as long as the attacks they faced could not completely destroy all the destroyers at once and were reduced to a battle of attrition, the destroyers would definitely be the victors. Even the seemingly endless silicon-based life forms at the void-comprehending stage were no exception. Moreover, even if the situation was a little worse, if the silicon-based life forms were truly endless and would never disappear, Luo Fan could still unleash mystical abilities and create more combinations of powers, constructing more destroyers to increase his side's combat power. Then, they would continue to expand until they finally swept through the entire space-time, completely destroying all silicon-based life forms. The only difference was the amount of time it took to complete the process. This was the characteristic of space-time. Destroying the silicon-based life forms now was equivalent to destroying the space-time, destroying the projected will of the Iron Age. Under such circumstances, the flow of time in this space-time could only be faster than the projected will of the Iron Age. Therefore, time was more than enough for him. With that being the case, how could Luo Fan possibly be worried? How could he possibly be anxious? Apart from that, he had also gained a lot from observing and deducing the key to the core of this space-time over the past few dozen days. At this moment, he had already locked onto several locations that were extremely far away, which might be the key to the core of this space-time. This meant that he had almost found a way to destroy this space-time and the projected will of the heaven and earth. Therefore, he did not have to worry or be anxious. Although the space-time seemed boundless, it was not a real universe after all. Therefore, its scale was not calculated in hundreds of millions of light-years like the real universe. Those locations that were extremely far away from where Luo Fan was. It was only tens of thousands of light-years away. In this way, although the entire space-time seemed incomparably vast, it was only equivalent to the size of a river system. It was not much different from the space-time that Luo Fan had opened up in his universe in his sleeve. Although the smoke left behind by the destruction of the silicon-based life forms seemed to form a thick metal sphere that enveloped Luo Fan and the destroyers, it did not actually obstruct Luo Fan's vision much. He did not even need to use any vision ability to easily see through the smoke. As for seeing through the blockage of the silicon-based life forms, it was not much of a problem from a macroscopic perspective. Although these silicon-based life forms densely filled the void within a radius of tens of millions of miles around Luo Fan's body. From a normal point of view, the gap between the silicon-based life forms was still quite large, enough for Luo Fan's line of sight to pass through and see outside. The reason for this was not complicated. The silicon-based life forms naturally needed a certain amount of space to move when they used their ability to attack Luo Fan. As for overlapping each other, the problem of blocking the front and back could be achieved by slightly bending one's vision. Bending one's vision seemed inconceivable, but secular people could do it with the help of things like mirrors. With Luo Fan's current divine might of void enlightenment, he could easily do it with a mere thought. This was also the prerequisite for Luo Fan to be able to find the unknown key points of the space-time core amidst the siege of the countless silicon-based life forms over the past few dozen days. Evidently, for Luo Fan, anything that could not block his vision would not be able to stop him from passing through. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a light stride forward, his figure following his vision. In a trance, he had already traversed a distance of tens of thousands of light years and arrived at the first place that could be the key point of the space-time core. This was a small galaxy. The light that emanated from it was extremely mysterious, and the metallic luster was extremely exquisite, even close to the origin of steel. The 36 planets that existed in this galaxy were also moving in an extremely subtle way, faintly having some special connection with the entire space-time. Unfortunately, it's not. Luo Fan extended his perception and scanned the galaxy slightly. He knew that this was not the key point of the space-time core, but a special place that corresponded to a galaxy that was similar to the protagonist of the Iron Age. There would always be protagonists in any era. Galaxies had protagonists. Galaxies had protagonists. Planets had protagonists. Intelligent life forms had protagonists, and intelligent life forms had specific protagonists. In this aspect, there was no essential difference in any era, any world, or any universe. The reason why this galaxy before him seemed special was because it corresponded to a galaxy that was the protagonist of a galaxy in the Iron Age. As Luo Fan scanned the galaxy slightly, countless silicon-based life forms appeared out of thin air around him, attacking him without any regard for their lives. Luo Fan could not be bothered to resist. With a thought, he followed his vision to another possible location. In a trance, he passed through the void again and arrived at the second location. Unfortunately, this location was still a little special, a place that corresponded to a certain special location in the Iron Age projection. However, it was not the real key point of this space-time. Although Luo Fan was a little disappointed that he had missed twice in a row, it was not unexpected. He did not wait for the silicon-based life forms to appear and attack him, and he directly headed for the third location. Just like that, Luo Fan went to 6 locations before stopping at the 7th, which was the second-last location. This place was not a solar system, but a lonely steel planet that floated in the boundless nothingness, without any light or vitality. This is it. As his perception swept across this steel planet, a mysterious feeling appeared in his heart, allowing him to instantly confirm that this was the location he was looking for. He could not help but be overjoyed. Chapter 899. When Luo Fan had used the spatial shift, the destroyers he had sent out had not been left behind. They had followed him as he had used the spatial shift. They had been by his side the entire time, accompanying him as he moved through the entire space-time tens of thousands of light years away. At this moment, although the countless silicon-based life forms attacks were extremely powerful and fast, compared to the beginning, there was no fundamental change in the situation. The attacks were still easily blocked by the destroyers. In fact, because the destroyers had come too hastily, the destroyers had grasped many flaws, allowing them to block the attacks of the countless silicon-based life forms with even greater ease. In such a situation, Luo Fan did not care too much. Previously, he had been able to rely on the destroyers to protect him for dozens of days, but he had been focused on finding the key to the core of this space-time. Now that he had found the core, he could naturally leave his safety to the destroyers and do whatever he wanted. With a thought in his mind, he landed on the metal, celestial body below. This celestial body floated alone in the void. There were no stars or similar celestial bodies around it. It floated there alone, emitting a desolate aura. The entire planet seemed to be made of metal, and it was rather flat. It did not look like a naturally formed metal planet. Instead, it looked like a huge man-made fortress. As he stood on the planet, Luo Fan felt his body tremble. In that instant, he felt as if his breathing, his movements, and every twitch of his muscles were connected to a vast and boundless existence. In a trance, those silicon-based life forms that were attacking him suddenly paused. After tens of thousands of them were destroyed by the tens of thousands of them, they swarmed toward Luo Fan even more ferociously and fearlessly, and the flickering light in their eyes all the time. It was as if a wisp of strange red light had been added to the light that seemed to be carrying out endless calculations, as if it had increased the hatred it had for Luo Fan. It was as if it had used all the means it had to kill itself, and the feeling of pulling Luo Fan along. However, it was a pity that even though they were more ferocious, more fearless, and more disregarding their own bodies, their offensive capabilities did not improve at all, at least for the destroyers. Their attacks had not reached the point where they could completely destroy the destroyers. This meant that no matter how ferocious they were, no matter how reckless they were, no matter how unafraid of death they would still not be a match for the destroyers. Perhaps their various transformations meant nothing to the destroyer. It was just that the frequency of his attacks was faster and the transition of his movements was more exquisite. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to pay attention to this change. At this moment, his attention was completely focused on the planet beneath his feet. That wonderful feeling was none other than the moment he stood on this planet. His sense of nature's empathy was connected to this planet, and he instantly sensed the feeling of this planet. In other words, he sensed all sorts of other things that were connected to this planet. With such a feeling, even the most muddle-headed person would be able to tell that this planet was not simple. Moreover, Luo Fan had already analyzed that this planet was not a simple Luo Fan. At this moment, he understood. This planet was the key to the core of this entire space-time. It was also the key to the projection of the Iron Age's world will. If this projection of the world will was regarded as the will of a living being, then this planet was equivalent to this living being's life source. If Luo Fan wanted to clear this stage, he could directly destroy this planet. He could destroy this space-time, destroy this projection of the world will, and thus completely destroy the projection of the Iron Age. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan finally let out a long breath. His perception gushed out and directly poured into the planet below. The moment his perception came into contact with the planet, an indescribably flexible barrier appeared in front of Luo Fan's perception to block his perception. This barrier was unimaginably strong and flexible. An ordinary Terminator might not be able to break through the barrier and enter the planet even if they unleashed all their offensive abilities and destructive abilities, let alone using their perception. However, Luo Fan was clearly not in Terminator. The moment his perception sensed this barrier, it trembled slightly and produced countless exquisite and unfathomable changes. It was as if a martial arts master who controlled all martial arts truth was displaying his martial arts. With a few tugs, it broke through the barrier and directly invaded the planet below. The instant Luo Fan's perception invaded the planet, a boundless amount of information drowned him through his perception. At this moment, the countless silicon-based life forms that had been attacking Luo Fan nonstop for the past few weeks disappeared without a trace. It was as if they had never appeared. At the same time, in Luo Fan's mind and will, the countless information that swarmed in and completely drowned his mind and was suddenly condensed into countless powerful silicon-based life forms out of thin air. These silicon-based life forms were condensed from information. In essence, they were waves of information, but they possessed unparalleled might. Each silicon-based life form corresponded to the countless silicon-based life forms that had been locked in a stalemate with the Terminators outside. Each silicon-based life form gave off an aura that was not inferior to that of the silicon-based life forms outside. In other words, each silicon-based life form was at least at the void comprehending realm. As soon as these endless silicon-based life forms appeared, they began to destroy Luo Fan's mind and will without regard for anything else. They began to attack Luo Fan's memories in a frenzy, treating the endless memories in Luo Fan's mind as enemies that would not rest until one of them was dead. They began to attack without regard for anything else. During this process, the amount of information that kept surging in through his perception was still endless, showing no signs of stopping due to the existence of these silicon-based life forms. They continued to surge into his mind and will. At the same time, they continued to condense more and more silicon-based life forms, joining in the destruction of Luo Fan's mind and memories. The entire process happened so suddenly and strangely that Luo Fan could not come up with an effective response for a while. In an instant, he felt that a small part of his memories had been destroyed by the silicon-based life forms formed by the information. Even his mind and will were severely damaged by the destruction of these silicon-based life forms. This damage caused his body to undergo an inexplicable change. His eyes suddenly flashed with a trace of confusion, and his face directly became incomparably pale. At the same time, his body trembled uncontrollably. It was as if he suddenly could not perfectly control the body that he originally had complete control over. So that's how it is. So these silicon-based life forms are just the thoughts of this projected world. It's no wonder that they can be destroyed and then reborn. Even if the power contained in them is completely destroyed, there won't be any losses at all. Luo Fan came to a sudden realization, and such a thought appeared in his mind and will. These thoughts flashed by. Afterward, his mind and will suddenly flashed, and an inexplicable change took place. A boundless universe, void, instantly took form in his mind and will, directly enveloping the countless silicon-based life forms. It completely separated the silicon-based life forms from his mind and will, as well as his memories. Although those silicon-based life forms were struggling and destroying with all their might during this process, they were still completely enveloped by this void in the end. They were completely separated from Luo Fan's consciousness. No matter how much they tried to destroy them, they were limited to this void, even if the aftermath was transmitted out. Even though there were repercussions that spread out, they only caused his mind and will to suffer a great impact. They were unable to destroy his mind and will like before. When Luo Fan became an innate golden Luo, his spirit had already reached perfection. His will, mind, memories, and even everything inside and outside of his body had reached perfection. At this moment, he had already become a void comprehender. This degree of perfection was naturally stronger than when he was an innate golden Luo. And this kind of great perfection allowed his mind, thoughts, and memories to possess powerful self-healing abilities. Therefore, even though the destruction of the silicon-based life forms contained various mysterious auras that contained the profoundness of the void comprehending realm that were hard to get rid of, they could not completely block his memories. His mind and will recovered once again. At most, it would only slow down his recovery speed, preventing him from completely recovering to his peak state within a short period of time. Sensing the various changes in his mind, will, and memories, Luo Fan finally heaved a sigh of relief. However, he did not completely relax. This situation meant that he had not suffered any irrecoverable damage, which was naturally a good thing. However, right now, the situation before him was not relaxing at all. It was not enough for him to completely relax. The place he was standing at was none other than the crux of this space-time, as well as the crux of this entire projection of the world's will. All the information he had obtained from within this planet was the most fundamental. This was the form of existence of this Iron Age projection of the world's will, as well as the profound mysteries of how it operated. It was also what he wanted to obtain, the profound mysteries of this projection of the world's will. Unless he was willing to leave empty-handed, he would have to take all the information as his own, or, at the very least, he would have to have a near complete understanding of it. However, The situation at this moment was that the information had actually condensed into many silicon-based life forms and countless living beings. It was completely different from what he had encountered in the other projection platforms, where the will of the universe had allowed him to comprehend as he pleased. Instead, it was attacking him intensely, wanting to destroy everything about him. This meant that if he wanted to comprehend the information and obtain the profound mysteries within, he would have to defeat these silicon-based life forms without suffering any losses. Moreover, he would have to defeat a silicon-based life form that was comparable to avoid comprehending existence for every bit of information he obtained. It was easy to imagine what a monumental task it would be. How could he completely relax? Not good. All of a sudden, Luo Fan sensed that the impact on his mind had become so powerful that it could affect his state of mind. He could not help but frown. After sensing slightly, he discovered that the number of silicon-based life forms in the strange space-time constructed by his mind had unknowingly increased to an indescribable level. His boundless space-time had almost been filled up by those silicon-based life forms. At this moment, the endless silicon-based life forms launched attacks at the same time, almost causing the entire space-time to tremble violently. It was as if it was about to collapse instantly. Even the space-time was unable to completely block off such an impact. A small portion of it was transmitted out, shaking his mind and thoughts. This was why the current situation had occurred. That space-time had been created by Luo Fan's will. To the real world, it was a completely illusory existence. It was an existence of nothingness, but for information, for will for the soul. However, to information, will, and spirit, it was an extremely real existence. Its size was completely dependent on Luo Fan's imagination and thoughts. As long as he dared to imagine and could imagine the crucial details of such a huge space-time, he would be able to construct that space-time in his mind and thoughts, regardless of its size or how stable it was. To Luo Fan, the number of space-time structures that he had seen was extremely numerous. Even the space-time and worlds that he had opened up were counted in the tens of millions. Under such circumstances, how could it be difficult for him to imagine the crucial details of space-time? Therefore, at the instant he sensed that this space-time was almost filled up, the space-time trembled with a single thought, and countless densely packed space-times appeared in the surroundings. These space-times were densely stacked together with the space-time at the very beginning. They were like countless cells, forming an extremely huge finger. It was a finger that was formed from billions of space-times. At the instant these space-times appeared, the countless silicon-based life forms were instantly separated and placed into the countless new space-times that had appeared. The pressure on the initial space-time was instantly reduced by countless times. The tremors in his mind and thoughts instantly weakened to an almost undetectable extent. Of course, tremors were still present. As long as those silicon-based life forms did not stop destroying that space-time, there would definitely be repercussions transmitted out to shake his mind and thoughts. No matter how hard Luo Fan tried to block them, he was unable to change anything. He expanded one space-time into billions of space-times. They formed an extremely huge finger that completely treated space-time as cells or even atoms. This change was naturally grand and vast beyond imagination. However, compared to the endless information that was gushing into his mind and thoughts, this was merely a response that treated the symptoms but not the root cause. How much information could a projection of the worlds will contain? It was almost endless. This could be seen from the fact that when he had been comprehending the projection of the world's will in the other stages, he had been receiving information that could cause the invaders' minds to collapse for thousands of years at every moment. Every piece of such information could be transformed into silicon-based life forms at the void and lightning realm. It was imaginable what kind of state the silicon-based life forms could reach. It was a terrifying number that could not even be described by numbers. Under such circumstances, even if he could increase those space-times by countless times, even if he could imagine countless space-times as vast as the Earth and the universe, it would still be filled by those silicon-based life forms one day. At that time, The silicon-based life forms would directly destroy the boundless expanse of space, and they would cover the heavens and the earth and drown his mind, soul, and memories. If he extracted these information bit by bit, it would naturally not pose any threat to him. However, if all the information that originally needed 100 years to be completely extracted erupted in an instant, not to mention that Luo Fan was just a void enlightening realm, even a Tao integration realm, a transcendent realm, or even a Tao master might not be able to bear it. Moreover, his goal was to completely obtain the mysteries contained in the information that had been transformed into silicon-based life forms. No matter how much information was transformed into silicon-based life forms and kept accumulating, it was of no use to his ultimate goal. For him, increasing the spacetimes was naturally just a temporary solution. As these thoughts flashed across his mind, Luo Fan wanted to extract his perception from the planet below. These silicon-based life forms were transformed by the infinite information transmitted from the planet below after his perception invaded it. As long as his perception was separated from the planet, there would naturally be no more information transmitted into it, and no more silicon-based life forms would be born. In that case, he would naturally have enough time to deal with the countless silicon-based life forms in his mind, and he did not have to sit back and watch them grow stronger. However, the moment he extracted his perception from the planet, an indescribable force locked onto his perception and body, making him unable to move at all. No matter how he extracted his perception, it was unable to leave the planet. It was as if it had become one with the planet. In an instant, Luo Fan understood that the real resistance of the projected will of the world had appeared. He made a prompt decision to completely cut off the part of his perception that had invaded that planet. However, the result was the same. No matter how hard he tried, it was as if there was a force locking down that perception. He could not control that perception with any of his thoughts, nor could he completely cut it off. It was as if that perception had become an indestructible and immortal object. Sensing these changes, Luo Fan frowned, creating a space-time in his mind to accommodate these silicon-based life forms, completely separating them from his mind and preventing them from coming into direct contact. This was something that Luo Fan could think of and do. However, it was not so easy to break up these silicon-based life forms and absorb the mysteries of their information. At least, when Luo Fan was creating the magical ability before, he had never thought of such a situation. He had never thought that there would be countless powerful and unparalleled living beings making things difficult for him in his mind. How could there be a corresponding magical ability to deal with this situation? Chapter 900. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, countless profound mysteries of power flashed through his mind in an instant. At this time, Luo Fan was already at the greater mastery of the void enlightening realm. His comprehension of power was many times stronger than when he was at the perishment realm and half a step into the void enlightening realm. In the past, any one of the endless mysteries of power that flashed through his mind would have been enough for him to break through the barrier of knowledge and break through from the half a step into the void realm to the true void realm. At this moment, however, these mysteries surged out like common knowledge. In order to deal with the powerful silicon-based life forms that were condensed from endless information, the most perfect way to deal with them was naturally thoughts. Therefore, the profundities of power that flowed through his mind at this moment were all related to his thoughts. Outside, Luo Fan's expression kept changing as his body changed. Sometimes he was overjoyed, sometimes he was puzzled, as if he had fallen into some extremely difficult problem. As for the planet below, there were still no changes, as if nothing had happened. As for this strange space and time, it was extremely calm. Even the smoke that was left behind after the countless silicon-based life forms were destroyed had completely dissipated at some point in time, fusing back into this space and time. As a result, the surface of the space and time looked no different from before. The dozens of destroyers that Luo Fan had condensed did not disappear at this moment. Instead, they fell silent in various postures in the space several dozen kilometers around Luo Fan. At this moment, it seemed like there was no need for these destroyers to exist at all. However, this was the space-time where the projection of the will of the universe from the Iron Age was. Luo Fan could not guess what might have happened here. In any case, these destroyers would not waste any of his power after leaving his body, nor would they cause him any pressure. Naturally, he could not be bothered to recall them. He just let them hover at the side to guard him. Time passed extremely quickly. In a blink of an eye, 3 days and 3 nights had passed. During these 3 days and 3 nights, the amount of information that surged into Luo Fan's mind from the planet had reached an unimaginable level. The number of silicon-based life forms that were condensed from the information had increased by trillions of times. The billions of spacetimes that made up the finger had unknowingly been filled by the silicon-based life forms. The undulations that seeped out from those spacetimes had unknowingly become so great that they could almost affect Luo Fan's emotions. Suddenly, Luo Fan suddenly opened his eyes, and a strange smile appeared on his face. At the same time, a look of enlightenment flashed through his eyes. His cultivation realm actually showed signs of loosening, showing signs of breaking through the great success of the void comprehending realm and changing towards perfection. I didn't expect there to be unexpected gains. However, this is also true. Greatly increasing the power of one's thoughts can naturally improve one's state of mind, and one's comprehension of the realm will naturally be enhanced. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. But these thoughts, however, were no longer as formless and intangible as before, flashing by. Instead, it seemed to be radiating light, illuminating a large portion of his mind. After a long while, it gradually disappeared. Instead, they seemed to be radiating light, illuminating a large area of his mind. After a while, it gradually disappeared. This kind of performance had already undergone an earth-shattering change, and there was an unimaginable improvement. This was what he had comprehended in the past 3 days and 3 nights. Some performance after combining thoughts and power. Sensing that the space-time that was constructed in his mind was about to be unable to withstand the destruction from the increasing number of silicon-based life forms, Luo Fan did not hesitate. Countless thoughts gathered in his mind and suddenly turned into an extremely flexible and extremely real clear light. This light was so mysterious. As soon as it appeared, it cleansed his entire mind and incorporeal. It cleared away all the impurities that had appeared in it, causing his mind to become clear and transparent. His state of mind and thoughts became many times better than before. Countless questions that would have taken him several years to think clearly in the past could be solved with just a glance. The perfect space-time that would have taken him a long time to imagine in the past was done in an instant. At this moment, the finger that was constructed from countless space-times finally could not withstand the bombardment from the countless silicon-based life forms and gradually collapsed. Along with the collapse, endless brilliance, endless power, and endless attacks rushed out from the destroyed space-time. Along with the light, power, and attacks rushed out. There were also endless silicon-based life forms. Each of them was a silicon-based life form that was at least at the void comprehending realm. When this change occurred, the clear light in Luo Fan's mind and incorporeal mind suddenly trembled and swept out toward the countless silicon-based life forms, light, power, and attacks. In an instant, the endless attacks, light, and power were directly brushed into countless pieces of information and integrated into his mind and incorporeal mind. This made Luo Fan feel that he had instantly received countless mysteries of the worlds while projected in the Iron Age. These silicon-based life forms were condensed from countless pieces of information, and they were also thoughts that projected the world's will. The attacks they unleashed, the power they unleashed, and the brilliance they produced were naturally also information. Luo Fan had spent 3 days and 3 nights searching for hundreds of millions of combinations of powers and thoughts to find this power combination that was formed from hundreds of thousands of powers and thoughts. It was a peerless, remarkable ability that could return all thoughts and information to their origins. Therefore, The powers, light, and attacks could be brushed back to their origins so easily. Moreover, it was the most fundamental, the origin that had completely eliminated the world's will imprint. It was because the world's will imprint had been eliminated that the information no longer had all sorts of mysterious changes. It was just ordinary information and would not undergo any inexplicable changes, let alone condense into any life forms. This way, the information could easily integrate into Luo Fan's mind and incorporeal mind, allowing him to comprehend it clearly and finally understand the profoundness within. The clear light enveloped his mind and incorporeal mind. As long as any existence formed from information entered his mind and incorporeal mind, it would naturally be returned to its origins, returning to the most fundamental essence of information. It was the same for those attacks, and the silicon-based life forms were naturally no exception. After the attacks were completely absorbed by Luo Fan, the silicon-based life forms also collapsed, as the clear light converted them into endless information and integrated into his mind and incorporeal mind. Luo Fan directly comprehended the various mysteries of the worlds that was projected in the Steel Age. This information, it was no different from the information he had sensed from the projected wills of the world in the other trials. However, the profoundness contained within it was much stronger than the profoundness he had comprehended before. Although it was just the beginning, Luo Fan could already sense that his cultivation realm was rising at a visible rate. Even if there was a huge gap between the greater mastery and perfection of the void-comprehending realm, with this rate of improvement, it would take a long time for him to overcome this gap and break through the greater mastery to perfection. It was only something that could be predicted for a period of time. It turns out that the worlds will actually exist in such a form. No wonder the information transmitted has such mysterious changes. In the process of continuously comprehending the information of the silicon-based life forms, Luo Fan gradually peeped into the difference between the Steel Age and the Other Age projections. He understood the reason why the Steel Age projection could have such incredible changes. However, even though he understood, he was still unable to say it out loud. It was just like the axioms in mathematics. Everyone knew that it was correct, but it was almost impossible to prove it. It could be said that it was a kind of understanding, an indescribable change. However, although it could not be described in words, it was still quite beneficial to him. After he understood the mystery, the clear light that filled all areas in his mind also underwent inexplicable changes. It seemed to have become clearer, more flexible, more condensed, more real, and more agile. There were such changes. As a result, the clear light was able to restore the origin of the countless silicon-based life forms even faster and easier. The amount of information he received at every moment was also becoming more and more numerous. In this process, the speed at which the space-time collapsed gradually slowed down. After half of the space-time had collapsed, the entire space-time finally stopped collapsing and formed a stable, broken finger. The reason for this was very simple. At this moment, the information that entered his mind through his senses no longer needed to be transferred into space. Instead, it was directly sent into the clear light, allowing the clear light to directly return it to its origin. The brand of the will of the world within it was completely wiped away, and the information was converted back into the source of information that fused into his mind. In this process, the information did not even have time to be transformed into silicon-based life forms or undergo any abnormal changes before it was directly returned to its origins. There were no more silicon-based life forms entering those space-time, and the silicon-based life forms that originally existed in those space-time did not break through the limits of the space-time, so they naturally could not cause more damage. Thus, those space-time naturally remained intact. Faced with this increasingly stable situation, Luo Fan finally relaxed completely. A thought flashed through his mind, and many passageways appeared in the space-time constructed in his mind, connecting that space-time and Luo Fan's mind. Along these passageways, the clear light slowly seeped into those space-time. Although those space-time existed in Luo Fan's mind and were constructed by his own imagination, they could isolate the inside from the outside world. However, they were able to isolate the inside from the outside so that the destruction of the silicon-based life forms in that space-time wouldn't affect his mind. This naturally meant that these space-time and his mind had a relatively independent characteristic. Such relative independence made it so that the clear light formed from Luo Fan's thoughts after his essence had been upgraded could not directly enter those space-time. Therefore, he needed these passageways to allow the clear light to enter those space-time and return those silicon-based life forms to their origins, turning them back into origin information. The might of this clear light was unimaginably great. Just now, the countless attacks from the silicon-based life forms that broke through the space-time and entered his mind had been easily wiped out. At this moment, it was naturally even easier for him to deal with these silicon-based life forms that were restricted in those space-time. Soon, the silicon-based life forms that existed in those space-time and could not even be accurately described by the numerical limit were returned to their origins, turning them into endless information. Of course, he did not immediately fuse this information into his mind. At this moment, his mind was already somewhat overwhelmed due to the large wave of information that had integrated into it. He was still in a state of recovery, and it was already a little difficult for him to bear the incessant influx of information from the outside world. How could he integrate more than half of the information that he had received in the past 3 days and 3 nights? The impact from earlier was clearly too powerful for him. It was obvious that he was too strong, and it was enough to cause him irreparable damage. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had placed those pieces of information in those space-time, turning them into a vast and boundless ocean of information. It was not until a few days later, when he had completely eliminated the aftereffects of the impact, that he gradually relaxed the restrictions on those pieces of information. He allowed those pieces of information to integrate into his mind in an orderly manner, allowing them to be analyzed and absorbed by him. In order not to cause too much pressure on himself, he spent close to 1 day and 1 night to completely absorb those pieces of information, allowing those space-time to be completely emptied. This kind of time allocation was barely equivalent to the speed at which those pieces of information had entered his mind in the beginning. Although there was pressure on him, it did not break through his limits, so it naturally did not affect him at all. After dealing with that, there was no longer a need for those space-time to exist. With a flash of Luo Fan's mind, those space-time had completely disappeared without a trace. His mind and will once again became one, and the clear light that filled his mind and will were completely connected. As it circulated, there was no longer the slightest hindrance, and it became even smoother. This change caused the power of the clear light to become even more powerful. It became faster and easier to return the information to its source. Moreover, after returning the information to its source, it became purer and clearer, so it was naturally easier to analyze and comprehend it. When all the changes were completed, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He sat down cross-legged on that planet, spread his hands, and pressed them down toward the planet. At the same time, his perception, which had pierced into the planet below, was suddenly magnified by more than 10 times. As he did this, the information that poured into his perception suddenly increased by more than 10 times. The surge of information even caused his mind and will to tremble violently. Even the clear light did not have time to convert those pieces of information, and a lot of the information condensed into silicon-based life forms that were even more powerful than those that existed before. Thankfully, even though these silicon-based life forms were much more powerful than before, their intrinsic nature had not changed. They were still formed from information, and they were still unable to withstand the return of the clear light. After taking form, they were unable to transcend for an instant, and were turned back into the source of information, directly fusing into his mind and will. As expected, the endurance of my mind and will has greatly increased. When the changes stabilized again, Luo Fan could not help but be overjoyed and think to himself. Previously, he had sensed that he had combined his will with hundreds of thousands of types of power, causing the will to undergo all sorts of mysterious changes. While its power had increased by many times, it had also allowed his mind and will to obtain many benefits. This endurance was one of the benefits. It was precisely because of this feeling that he dared to expand the channel of information transmission by 10 times. The current situation clearly confirmed his previous thoughts, indicating that the endurance of his mind and will was indeed much stronger than before. How could he not be happy about this? Although the channel of information had been expanded by 10 times. Even so, when Luo Fan completely received all the information from the projected world's will, 100 years had still passed. In total, it was not much different from the time he had spent on the previous 2,000 or so checkpoints. The reason for this was simple. Although he had increased the channel of information by 10 times, allowing him to receive 10 times more information at every moment, the structure of the projected worlds was also 10 times more complicated than the other checkpoints. In other words, the amount of information contained within was also 10 times more than the other checkpoints. With such a combination, the time spent was naturally not much different. On a certain day, 100 years later, when Luo Fan had finally received all the information and vaguely felt that he had completely understood the form of existence of the projected world's will of the Iron Age, he slowly withdrew his hands and opened his eyes. There was understanding in those eyes, as well as hints of bewilderment. It's a pity that I didn't break through. After a long while, he sighed and slowly rose. Over the last 100 years, he had received innumerable information regarding the structure and existence of the projected world's will, comprehending many mysteries that he did not understand before. His attainment had also improved greatly as a result. However, the final result was that he was still at greater mastery of void comprehension. Even if he was already at the peak of greater mastery and was only a sliver away from breaking through, he still did not break through greater mastery and achieve consummation. Chapter 901. However, although he was a little disappointed, he had obtained a lot of benefits after all. Luo Fan would not lament over it like an ordinary person. After sensing that he could no longer obtain any new information from the huge planet below, with a thought, he raised his hand and waved. The dozens of destroyers around him suddenly gathered together and came directly to Luo Fan, forming a huge destroyer that was dozens of times larger than the original. After this destroyer was formed, he did not hesitate at all. He shook his body, clenched his right hand into a fist, and suddenly punched down. Without any obstruction, he bombarded the huge planet below. In an instant, countless strange shadows of gears flashed across the surface of the planet. These gears assembled together in an extremely mysterious way, directly enveloping the planet, making it seem like the planet had been formed by a combination of gears. These gears were densely packed together. Every one of them looked like a real gear, but in fact they were completely formed by the combination of endless strange runes. Each gear had billions of runes. These runes were condensed to the extreme. They were like tiny dots that formed the endless, densely packed gears. After the destroyer bombarded the planet, the gears flashed out and began to operate rapidly. It was as if the entire planet had started to move, as if the entire power of the planet had been activated in an instant. An indescribable power was generated during this process. Countless silhouettes of silicon-based life forms suddenly appeared from the gaps of these gears, directly rushing into the sky and converging towards the countless destroyers. These silhouettes of silicon-based life forms looked countless times smaller than those that had been condensed before, whether it was in the real world or in Luo Fan's sea of knowledge. However, the power and aura they emitted were not the slightest bit inferior. With such existences condensed together and converging on the destroyer, the power was even more powerful and astonishing. For a moment, countless cracks appeared on the destroyer's body, as if it was about to collapse under the bombardment of the silhouettes of silicon-based life forms. However, this was only about to happen. At this moment, the power of the destroyer had completely poured into the planet below. The gear silhouette formed by countless runes seemed to be overwhelmed and collapsed. All the light turned into shock waves that exploded in all directions. In an instant, it turned into ripples of light. It engulfed the entire space-time. As the gear completely exploded and collapsed, the countless tiny silhouettes of silicon-based life forms that had shot out from between the gears lost their source of energy and also collapsed and disappeared without a trace. Naturally, the destruction of the huge destroyer completely stopped. As for the destroyer, it was just a product formed from the combination of power. No matter how great the injury, it could recover in an instant. After all, the tiny silicon-based life forms disappeared. The cracks on the destroyer's body flashed and disappeared. He had completely returned to normal. The entire process seemed long and complicated, but in reality, it was over in a flash. From a moment the destroyer's fist landed until all the gears exploded into specks of light, not even a split second had passed. The starting lineup during this process, Luo Fan's expression was incomparably calm. He had spent the previous 100 years comprehending the mysteries of the projected will of heaven and earth. Although he did not truly understand the form of existence of the projected will of heaven and earth, and could not understand its way of thinking, he already knew how mysterious the core was. However, he was already aware of just how mysterious this core was. Hence, he was already well aware of the various mysterious changes that had occurred earlier. At this moment, everything was going as he had expected. Naturally, his expression would not change because of this. The destroyer's fist only paused for a moment when the countless silhouettes of the gears flashed. Immediately after that, it continued to blast downwards, drilling into the interior of the planet below and unleashing all of its destructive might. In an instant, the huge planet, which was neither a planet nor a star, instantly swelled up. Countless cracks appeared on the planet from the inside to the outside. Then, an incomparably powerful shock wave exploded in all directions. Following that, an incomparably powerful shock wave exploded in all directions. This was the most important planet in this space-time. It was the core of the projection of the world's will, which was equivalent to the origin of life. It was instantly torn into countless fragments, turning into metal dust that exploded in all directions. Then, an extremely powerful shock wave swept through the entire space-time. Although this space-time was hundreds of thousands of light-years wide, such a vast volume could only exist when the space-time was still intact. When the space-time was fundamentally destroyed, such a huge scale was naturally useless. It was precisely because of this that whether it was the speck of light caused by the destruction of the gear or the shock wave and metal dust caused by the planet's destruction, all of them could ignore the huge scale of hundreds of thousands of light-years and instantly engulf the entire region. As the planet exploded, time and space exploded as well. In this space-time, the projection of the true age of steel shattered into countless fragments and dust, revealing a brand new and inconceivable place, the 9001 SD level. In that instant, a strange wave of information appeared in his mind out of nowhere, instantly drowning his mind and consciousness. The amount of information was incomparably huge, and it was many times more than the information backlash he had encountered in the previous 2,000 or so levels. Even Luo Fan, who had almost mastered void enlightenment, could not completely ignore such a huge amount of information. He only felt that his mind and consciousness were completely drowned in the boundless ocean of information. The endless mysteries of the world and the endless truths of the universe were frantically attacking his mind. In fact, in that instant, he even felt like he was about to lose himself. Fortunately, his senses and thoughts had already gone through the most fundamental upgrade. They were many times stronger than before, and had wondrous uses that were many times stronger than before. In that instant, his thoughts naturally moved, condensing into a large piece of clear light that enveloped the boundless information backlash of the Age of Steel. At the same time, his perception also turned into countless layers of silk nets, blocking the endless information in front of him. These two barriers were finally able to barely block the information from reaching them. This allowed his mind and consciousness to barely maintain autonomy in the information and not be lost because of the huge amount of information. Next, the clear light began to show its might, directly turning the huge amount of information into the source of information. As it fused into his mind and consciousness, it melted into his memories, allowing him to instantly understand countless mysteries about the Age of Steel. The entire process was many times slower than the previous 2,000 or so levels. After a few hours, he finally let out a long breath and completely absorbed all the information. When he opened his eyes, there was an inexplicable surprise in them. I didn't expect the information backlash of this level to be so mysterious. What an unexpected gain. Such a thought flashed in his mind. The information backlash of the Age of Steel projection was actually different from the information backlash of the projections of other eras. The projections of other eras, no matter how real, how powerful, how mysterious, the final information backlash was, even if there was a difference in quantity, there was not much difference in essence. It only contained the specific process of the era from that moment until it was finally destroyed and replaced by another era. It did not involve the projection of the world's will at all. Such a gain. For Khanate Grand Luo cultivators, there were naturally countless benefits, and it was also quite useful for existences in the perishment realm. But for Luo Fan, who was already a void comprehender, it was not of much use. However, it wasn't very useful. At most, it could increase his knowledge and experience. But at that moment, the information backlash of the Age of Steel projection was different. Apart from the information backlash of the projections of other eras, it also contained a deeper change in the projection of the world's evolution. Or rather, the information backlash did not just contain the entire process of the projection of this era from this moment until it was destroyed, but also the entire process of the projection of the world's will being replaced by another projection of the world's will. In such a situation, it was as if he was an ordinary person looking at life and death, and could only see the death of a person's physical body. At that moment, he had already opened his spirit eye and could see the process of the soul leaving the body and turning into a ghost. It was precisely because of the process of the projection of the world's destruction that the amount of information suddenly increased so much. Even Luo Fan, who could bear it easily in the past without any discomfort, almost got lost in it. However, although this was enough to make him excited, what made him even more surprised was that in the process just now, he had glimpsed a trace of the mysteries of the projection of the world. He could vaguely sense the existence of the projection of the world, and finally understood the trace of the flaw that prevented him from reaching perfect void comprehension. He broke through the barrier between greater void comprehension and perfect void comprehension. Unknowingly, he had already stepped into the perfect void comprehension stage. Previously, he had pursued bitterly for 100 years without being able to achieve a breakthrough. But at that moment, he had unknowingly broken through the shackles and obtained the progress that he had dreamed of. How could he not be surprised? After the surprise, he felt a sense of regret. He felt that the world was impermanent and that opportunities could not be predicted. If my guess is correct, the next 900 or so levels should not be much different from the projection of the Iron Age. With a thought, he looked around and thought to himself. He had already stepped into the 9,001st level, and around him was still a boundless starry sky. It seemed to be no different from the normal Earth universe, but the aura that it revealed had a charm that was completely different from the Age of Chaos. At a glance, one could tell that this was not the Earth universe that his main body was in. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, a voice came from the void. This is the 9,001st level, the 3,002nd era before the Age of Chaos, the Age of Fate. The way to pass this level is to destroy this era. This voice was the voice of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era. However, compared to before, this voice had a hint of ethereal charm. As soon as it entered one's ears, one would feel an indescribable feeling, and this voice would be firmly engraved in the depths of one's soul, never to be forgotten. It was very clear that the essence that the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era displayed was many times stronger than before. If it was said that it was just above the perishing realm back then and was not at the void and lightning realm, then at this moment it had far surpassed the void and lightning realm and might even have surpassed the Tao integration realm. This evolution process was a gradual change. Every time it appeared, the essence of the treasure spirit would become a little stronger than before, thousands of times stacked on top of each other. Unknowingly, it had already reached this level. It was unknown whether it was already this powerful to begin with, but it was now constantly relaxing the restrictions. It displayed more and more power, or it was continuously increasing during this process in order to resist Luo Fan's probing. However, no matter what method it was, it meant that the almighty being behind this no longer had any intention of hiding his existence. He did not mind letting Luo Fan guess that he had all sorts of schemes behind the scenes. Luo Fan could only sigh helplessly at the changes of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era. Although he knew that it would be difficult to gain anything, he still probed in the direction where the voice came from with his perception. His perception passed through countless space-time and finally reached the limit of what he could detect. In the end, as he expected, he did not gain anything at all. He could not sense the location of the treasure spirit of the bridge of the era at all. He shook his head and retracted his perception into his body. His eyes shone brightly. In an instant, with the help of the perspective that was 100 times more powerful than before, he had completely comprehended the various mysteries of the era of providence. He obtained the ability to move the void at will in the projection of the era of providence and open up space-time at will. After that, with a thought, he disappeared from this place and moved to somewhere in the era of providence. He directly began the process that he had done thousands of times before, and he began to search for the projection of the era of providence's will of heaven and earth. A few days later, in a mysterious space-time in the depths of the era of providence, Luo Fan frowned slightly as he faced the entire sea of clouds. This was the space-time where the projection of the era of providence's will of heaven and earth was located. The boundless sea of clouds in front of him was none other than the boundless true meaning of providence. It represented the essence of the existence of this era of providence. The era of providence was different from other eras. Other eras also had things like providence, but in other eras, providence was an extremely obscure existence that could only work in an indirect way. However, in this era of providence, providence was completely different from other eras. It was almost directly manifested. Anyone with a little bit of cultivation, or even ordinary living beings with slightly better eyesight, would be able to see it directly. Moreover, this kind of providence could even directly erupt with all kinds of power, directly playing the role of power. In other words, in this era, providence could even be absorbed by cultivators like absorbing power and could be used like using power. Through his comprehension and understanding of this era, Luo Fan's current understanding of the characteristics of providence had greatly improved compared to a few days ago. All kinds of mysteries of providence that he had not understood before were easily grasped by him. As I expected, the existence of the era of Steele's projection has indeed determined the characteristics of the next few levels. The boundless sea of providence in front of him tumbled endlessly, producing all kinds of strange changes and pouncing towards him. However, Luo Fan's expression was calm, and only such thoughts were surging in his mind. As he pondered, he took a light step forward and directly rushed into the sea of providence. He raised his hand and summoned the destroyer, which had changed its form and turned into a huge cloud to protect him. He began to search for the key to the core of this sea of providence. Although the destroyer did not exist in the form of a human body like the previous levels, it still had combat spirituality and could still exert unimaginable destructive power. Compared to the normal light of destruction, its power was not much stronger, but it could still easily crush opponents that the light of destruction could not deal with in the past. In the surrounding sea of providence, there were all kinds of strange seals, all kinds of strange cauldrons, and even tigers and leopards of providence, golden dragons of providence, and even all kinds of iron-blooded military flags. All kinds of strange forms of providence, with power that almost reached the peak of the void comprehending realm pounced towards Luo Fan. They wanted to directly crush Luo Fan and completely obliterate him. In this era of providence, providence had the characteristics of power and could directly attack and crush enemies. However, this did not mean that providence had really turned into a kind of power. Of course, the power here was power in a narrow sense, and not the broad sense of power in Luo Fan's worldview of power. Providence still had all kinds of unimaginable uses. It could still control fate and decide the fate of certain beings, objects, organizations, races, and so on. For example, at this moment, if this endless condensation of providence bombarded Luo Fan, not only would it damage Luo Fan's body, it would also make his luck extremely bad. And his bad fate would bring endless convenience to the attacks of the condensation of providence. For example, an attack that could make Luo Fan's body tremble slightly or make him vomit blood would definitely make him vomit blood after his luck became bad. An attack that had a 10% chance of hitting him would definitely become a 20%, 30%, or even 5%, 6%, or even 10%. In the face of such attacks, the cloud that the destroyer turned into did not flinch at all. It also condensed all kinds of strange things to attack the condensation of providence, making it so that no matter how many condensation of providence there were, they could not break through the barrier of the cloud and touch Luo Fan. This situation seemed to be almost identical to the situation where the will of the universe was projected in the space-time of the Iron Age. Chapter 902. 100 years later, Luo Fan had already arrived at the 9,990th checkpoint, which was the origin of the era, which was the 878,291st era before the Age of Chaos, the Primordial era. He had already passed through more than 900 checkpoints and the projections of more than 900 eras since the projection of the Age of Providence. Each of the projections of these eras was similar in nature to the projection of the Age of Steel, and they were all so mysterious. Every time the projection of an era was destroyed, the information backlash would include the entire evolution process of the projection of the heaven and earth will of that era from that moment to its complete destruction and replacement by another projection of the heaven and earth will. This included many mysteries that Luo Fan could not sense in the space-time projection of the heaven and earth will of that era, which allowed him to obtain countless mysteries about the composition and operation of the projection of the heaven and earth will. Unknowingly, his realm was improving. At this moment, when he arrived at the 9,990th checkpoint, Luo Fan was already showing signs of breaking through to the perfect void comprehension realm. The barrier between the void comprehension realm and the Tao integration realm was already extremely loose, as if it could completely disappear at any time and allow him to directly become a Tao integration realm cultivator. Hovering in the void, Luo Fan looked at the void in front of him that was no different from the other eras at first glance. He could not help but speculate about the word primordial in the name of this era. This era might be the true beginning of all eras. There might not be any eras before this era. Such a thought flashed through his mind. The reason for this was very simple. Apart from the name of this era, it was also because the boundless starry sky at this time looked no different from the normal Earth universe at first glance. There were also countless galaxies, stars, and planets. It was an endless void. However, as long as one took a closer look, one would find that this entire era was completely different from what he had experienced before. Whether it was the projection of those eras or the projection of the Forbidden Area, they were all fundamentally different. This was because the universe of this era was filled with endless auras of destruction and rebirth. This aura was as if this era had just experienced destruction that was close to the end of the world and had just ushered in a brand new life. It was the countless stars within. Countless planets also vaguely showed signs of changing from another form. In fact, if one's eyesight was a little stronger, they could even see that the universe was expanding in all directions in an unimaginable manner, rapidly expanding in an unimaginable manner. With Luo Fan's experience, how could he not guess what was going on in this era? How could he not guess what kind of incredible scene had happened before this era? That existed before this era. It was very likely that it was a complete existence like the great desolate world. It was a vast world with a round sky and square earth. In other words, before the start of this era, there was perhaps a kind of apocalyptic war going on. It was precisely this apocalyptic war that shattered the vast, prehistoric world into countless fragments, eventually forming the vast, boundless void of the universe at this moment, forming countless eras in a cycle of 6 billion years. Such a guess. At the moment, it was just a guess. Before he could surpass this era, it was impossible for Luo Fan to know whether this guess was true or not. The appearance of this era also made him understand that the 9,990th stage was very likely to be the last stage that existed in the form of an era projection. The reason was not complicated, because it had already reached the beginning of an era. Reaching the beginning of an era meant that the era vortex had already operated to the extreme, meaning that the projection of the era had already reached the extreme. There were still 9 more stages after this, and the difficulty would definitely not be easier than the 9,990th stage. If it was still an era projection, it would only be more realistic than the projection of the beginning era. Obviously, the projection of the primordial era had reached the pinnacle of realism. There couldn't be anything more realistic than the projection of the primordial era. Under such circumstances, the next stage couldn't possibly be a projection of the primordial era. As this thought arose in his mind, Luo Fan could not help but show a look of anticipation. Although the projection of the past 3,000 eras had given him countless benefits and allowed his cultivation realm to improve to the peak void comprehension realm, it also made him feel a little dull and monotonous. Although the performance of each era projection was different, and although each of them had various special mysteries, they were still, after all, the projection of an era. Luo Fan had long since gained experience, so, as long as he stepped into one of them, he would naturally be able to have a deep understanding of the projection of an era. He could even easily open up space-time and move the void in any of the era projections. He could also almost follow a fixed procedure to find the will of the world in the projection of an era. Under such circumstances, even Luo Fan could not help but feel a little bored. Perhaps this was also the reason why his cultivation realm had been progressing slowly and he had not become a Dao integration cultivator yet. In this initial era, there were not many living beings, but almost all of them were powerhouses. They were able to survive the apocalyptic war before this era. They were able to survive the tragic war that shattered the entire world into countless fragments. How could they be weaklings? However, these powerhouses were either healing, recovering, or comprehending the mysteries of this brand new universe at the moment. There are not many living beings around. At the very least, at this moment, although Luo Fan had a deep understanding of this brand new initial era, he did not sense any powerful aura of living beings. The method to pass this stage is still to destroy this era. Looks like I have to think about it carefully. I can't be as casual as before. Luo Fan pondered as he sensed the faint, powerful auras in this universe. Among these powerful auras, the weakest one was already beyond the connate zenith heaven. The strongest one, which even made Luo Fan tremble slightly, was at least a Dao integration cultivator that was thousands of times more powerful than him. Of course, this included the realms of Exterminator, Void Comprehending, and Dao integration. It was just the definition of realms that Luo Fan obtained from the Great Tianyuan world. Luo Fan had no idea how these existences were differentiated in the Earth's universe before this era, but it would definitely not be the same. Based on the reality of this era, there might not be much difference between these projections and the living beings that were left behind. Perhaps I can understand what the Earth's universe was like before this era through them. A thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This era was the beginning of an era and the origin of all eras. The era vortex that the era bridge led to was a vortex created by the tide of the era. In other words, no matter how powerful the vortex was, it could only project this era at most. What was it like before this era? It was impossible for him to place his hopes on the bridge of the eras to project it. He could only try to understand it through the creatures that had survived from before this era. As for why he wanted to understand it, it was pointless. For a cultivator, was it not instinct to pursue all the mysteries of heaven and earth? As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan gave up on the idea of immediately looking for the projection of the world's will of this era to break through the process. The thought flashed through his mind, and he headed toward the place where a living being that was slightly weaker than him, but still equivalent to the void comprehending realm, was entrenched. Luo Fan's understanding of the Primordial era was at this moment. Almost everything in this era was no longer secret to him. Moving through the void was naturally not a problem. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed tens of thousands of light years and arrived at a strange place. There were no stars or planets in this location, but there was a strange piece of land floating in the void. This land had a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers and was also tens of thousands of kilometers thick. There was a ring of strange light around this land, protecting it from collapsing and dispersing. At the same time, it provided light for everything on this land. As expected, there really was a battle that ended the world before this era. Luo Fan looked at the appearance of this land and confirmed his previous guess. At this moment, a long sigh came from the land. I didn't think that after the end of the world, I would still be able to meet a fellow cultivator. How delightful and regrettable. If you don't mind, come and get together. It was Luo Fan. The space-time ripples caused by moving through the void were not concealed at all, and it was sensed by the living being on the land. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan was slightly startled. Then, he couldn't help but rejoice that his luck was pretty good. He had encountered a relatively peaceful expert. Originally, he was prepared to fight this living being and show off his strength before asking some questions. However, now that the living being had invited him to meet, he naturally did not have to show off his strength. As such, he only smiled and said, "It is Luo Fan's pleasure to be able to meet you, fellow cultivator. Thank you for your hospitality." As he spoke, he took a step forward and crashed into the land. Although the brilliance around the land could protect the land, allowing it to remain intact and prevent the yuan qi on the land from dissipating, it had almost no hindrance to true experts. If the original expert had not invited Luo Fan, it would have been extremely impolite for him to crash in like this, and he might have offended the expert. Now that the expert had invited Luo Fan to enter, the situation was naturally completely different, and he could enter at will. Luo Fan was surprised that the expert was so peaceful, inviting him in without needing him to show off his strength. Little did he know that the relaxed manner in which he had crossed the void had already displayed his strength to the fullest. The expert had long since known just how powerful he was, so why would he need to show off his strength? This era was the Primordial era. When it was projected, this era had only just begun a few 100 million years ago. This was still the beginning of the era. This was evident from the fact that this era was still undergoing intense changes at this moment. The presence of destruction and the presence of new life still existed. Before this era had been so dangerous that it was like the end of the world after the Great Destruction. It was easy to imagine just how dangerous such a scene was. Over the past few 100 million years, even if the living being was equivalent to the perishment realm and was rather extraordinary, it could only protect the place where it lived. It could not comprehend more about the Earth's universe, and it could not adapt to the Earth's universe. It could not completely understand the laws of space-time. So how could it move through space? As a result, Luo Fan could move through space with ease, and his presence was so obscure that the living being could not sense him at all. How could the living being not understand that Luo Fan was more powerful than it? Being peaceful and humble when facing beings stronger than it was something that all rational beings would do. Luo Fan stepped into the circle of light and felt the extremely dense energy of the world surge towards him. The scene in front of him was like a mortal paradise. It was like a paradise in the mortal world. In an instant, It even gave him an indescribable illusion. It was as if he had stepped into an extremely vast, boundless, and ancient world. However, he came to his senses in an instant. He knew that this was a reaction from the aura contained in this land. And these auras, they were most likely from before this era. It really is a land from before this era. A faint look of joy flashed through Luo Fan's eyes. This land was hundreds of thousands of miles in circumference, and it looked like a huge mountain range. It was full of vitality, and there were countless plants and living beings. Among the mountains, there was also smoke rising faintly. There was even smoke rising up from the chimneys. It was clear that there were intelligent beings living here. With a slight sensing, Luo Fan knew just how many intelligent beings there were. There were countless living beings of all kinds in this entire mountain range of hundreds of thousands of miles. Among them, the intelligent beings had the appearance of natural Tao bodies, and they were clearly humans. There were close to 10 million of them. Among them, there were also many powerhouses. Some had even reached the pure sun level, and some were even half a step away from the great perfection level. For hundreds of millions of years, I finally meet a fellow Taoist again. Finally, we meet again. The heavens are really kind to Lomun. At this moment, a leisurely voice entered Luo Fan's ears. It was the voice of the being that had invited Luo Fan earlier. Luo Fan looked in the direction of the voice and saw an old Taoist priest smiling at Luo Fan at the peak of the mountains. The old Taoist priest had white hair and a rudimentary Taoist temple behind him. It exuded an ancient and otherworldly charm. I didn't expect fellow Taoists to be so benevolent. I really admire you. Luo Fan took a step and crossed tens of thousands of miles. He arrived in front of the old Taoist priest and let out a long sigh. He could already tell that the old Taoist priest's power had been completely poured into the land below. The circle of light that protected the land was not his magic at all, but a manifestation of his power. It was obvious that the old Taoist priest had used his own cultivation to forcefully protect the land and the many living beings living on it. Doing so would undoubtedly make the land indestructible and allow it to exist for a long time in the boundless universe. However, it also gave the old Taoist priest an unparalleled pressure. Not only did it prevent him from cultivating, but it also prevented him from feeling a lot of pain at all times. Luo Fan could not help but sigh and feel a trace of admiration. The old Taoist priest only smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you must be joking. I'm soft-hearted. As long as it's within my power, I can't bear to see these living beings who admire me die. It's really unpresentable." The old Taoist priest only smiled and said, "I'm Luo Fan. Greetings, fellow Taoist." Luo Fan saw him and smiled. He bowed to the old Taoist priest and introduced himself. Seeing this, the old Taoist priest also bowed and said, "I'm Taoist Gu Hong. Greetings, fellow Taoist." After the greetings, the old Taoist priest invited Luo Fan into the Taoist temple. The main entrance of the Taoist temple was not worshipping a deity or a statue, but a strange word. This word was complicated and mysterious. It was not any word that Luo Fan had seen before. Looking at the way it was written, it was similar to a rune, but it seemed even more complicated and mysterious. Luo Fan understood the meaning of the word as soon as he saw it. "Heart. I'm a disciple of the Worship Heart sect. I've never appeared in the world." It's normal that fellow Taoist doesn't know. Seeing the confusion in Luo Fan's eyes, the old Taoist priest knew that Luo Fan didn't understand why the word heart was worshipped. A trace of sadness flashed across his eyes, but he still explained with a smile. "I'm focused on cultivation and rarely interact with others. I'm ignorant. Please forgive me." Luo Fan could see that the old Taoist priest was a little sad and quickly apologized. "Haha, you worry too much. Now that the world has been destroyed, the past doesn't matter anymore. Why would I care about it?" The old Taoist priest laughed. However, even so, Luo Fan didn't really care. He respectfully bowed to the word heart that was worshipped every day. Though he wasn't a disciple of the Worship Heart sect, since the old Taoist priest worshipped the word heart every day, he couldn't be indifferent. It was necessary for him to show his respect. Seeing Luo Fan bow to the word heart, the old Taoist priest's eyes showed joy. He said, "My worship heart sect has always been regarded as an unorthodox sect. We are not the orthodox sect of the world and are looked down upon by others. I didn't expect you to have no prejudice against my worship heart sect. I thank you." Chapter 903. This was not the first time Luo Fan had seen a cultivator on the Bridge of Times. On the contrary, he had seen a cultivator at almost every checkpoint, in every projection of every era, and even in the projection of the Forbidden Area. Furthermore, among those cultivators, almost every single one of them was more powerful than Taoist Gu Hongzi at the moment. However, this was the first time he had the heart to communicate with the cultivators on the Bridge of Eras. There was no other reason than that he knew that he had a fundamental conflict with all the living beings in the projection of this era. This conflict could not be resolved by any means. He had come to the projection of the era and the projection of the Forbidden Land in order to completely destroy the projection of the era and the projection of the Forbidden Land. This was equivalent to completely obliterating and destroying all the living beings in the projection of the era and the projection of the Forbidden Land. Under such circumstances, the conflict between him and these living beings was naturally the most fundamental. In fact, it could even be said that there was an irreconcilable hatred between them. With that in mind, Luo Fan was naturally unwilling to interact too much with these cultivators. If he were to accidentally form some sort of shackles that would cause him to waver in his determination to destroy this era projection in this forbidden area, then it would be rather troublesome. Because of this, although he had sensed the presence of many cultivators in the previous 9,000 or so checkpoints, he had not done anything about it. At this moment, in the projection of the Primordial era. But the situation was completely different. Although he still had a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict with all living beings in this era projection. However, because of the uniqueness of this era, and because there would be no more eras before this era, it was possible that the Earth and the universe would never shatter. It was not yet a universe, but a normal, perfect world. The scene at that time, the appearance of the world at that time. Apart from finding out from the mouths of the cultivators in this era projection, he had no other way to see it. With such a restriction, he didn't want to have too many emotional ties with these cultivators. However, he had no choice but to harden his heart and break through the previous thousands of checkpoints to communicate with the cultivators in this era projection. After some pleasantries, Luo Fan lied that he had been focused on cultivation in the past and didn't know much about the world. Now that the world had shattered, in order to not forget the true appearance of the world, he wanted Taoist Lone Swan to tell him what the original world looked like and what mysteries there were. After hearing Luo Fan's words, Taoist Lone Swan didn't have too many doubts. That was only natural. Unless he knew that he was a projection and that this era was just a projection, who would have thought that Luo Fan was an outsider? Who would have thought that Luo Fan was here to destroy the projection of this era? Since Taoist Lone Swan didn't expect Luo Fan's origin, even if he doubted Luo Fan's words, he wouldn't doubt. However, he did not doubt his intentions. At most, he felt that Luo Fan had something that was difficult to say and could not explain to him too clearly. Therefore, after Luo Fan expressed his doubts, he started to tell Luo Fan about the universe before the Primordial era. Of course, in between, he also wanted to recall the lost world, but it wasn't just for Luo Fan. As Taoist Lone Swan explained, Luo Fan gained more and more knowledge about what the world before the Primordial era looked like. Before the Primordial era, the world wasn't like this boundless starry sky. Instead, it was like what Luo Fan had expected, a world with a round sky and a square earth. This world was boundless. Although it was much smaller than Earth's current universe, it was still a distance that could only be calculated on the scale of billions of light years. In this world, there were 4 continents and 4 boundless oceans. The 4 continents were the Dongsheng Divine Continent, the Nanzhan Divine Continent, the Aparagodania Continent, and the North Continent. The 4 oceans were the East Sea, the West Sea, the South Sea, and the North Sea. The Dead Ocean wasn't defined by the four sides of a continent. Instead, it corresponded to each continent in the east, west, south, and north, and was defined by four enormous sea eyes. Outside of these four continents, there were countless islands. These islands dotted the four oceans like stars in the sky, and there were no less living beings living on them than on a continent. Above these four continents were the 33 heavens. Every two of these 33 heavens were separated by a kind of barrier between heaven and earth. Each heaven was boundlessly vast. Although it wasn't as vast as the four continents below, it wasn't much smaller than a continent. Beyond the 33 heavens was the sky beyond heaven. Between the sky beyond heaven and the primal chaos was an incredibly mysterious place where 7 peerless saints lived. They were teachers and friends, the primeval Lord of Heaven, the Taishang Tao Father, the Grand Mist Ancestor, the Grand Mist Ancestor, the Monster Ancestor, the Amitabha Buddha, and the ancestor of the human race, Huang. These 7 saints stood at the highest peak of Earth's universe. They controlled the momentum of the world and protected the integrity of the world. When Taoist Gu Hong mentioned the 7 saints, his eyes were filled with reverence, resentment, and an indescribable fear. Luo Fan was rather surprised by his reaction. However, he soon thought of the reason and sighed softly. As expected, old Taoist Gu Hong soon mentioned that it was the battle between the 7 saints that shattered the Earth universe into countless fragments, turning the Earth universe, which originally had a round sky and a square Earth, into a boundless, desolate, and broken state. How could Taoist Gu Hong not feel resentful when faced with the culprits who caused the destruction of the world? However, how could he not be afraid that they could so easily shatter the world into such a state? As for reverence, it was something he had accumulated over the countless years of cultivation, the kind of reverence he had for the supreme realm. The battle between the saints really did shatter the world. Luo Fan finally confirmed his previous guess after hearing Taoist Gu Hong's words. He could not help but sigh. After that, Luo Fan asked old Taoist Gu Hong about the whereabouts of the 7 undying and indestructible saints. In the end, although Gu Hong's answer was out of his expectations, it was completely reasonable when he thought about it carefully. Taoist Gu Hong's answer was that he had no idea. The battle between the 7 sages was naturally impossible for the 7 of them to fight like ordinary cultivators in the void. Instead, it was a grand battle that stirred up the momentum of the world and mobilized billions of lives across the world. The battle involved almost every cultivator in the world, even Taoist Gu Hong. In the end, he was dragged into the whirlpool of battle. In a Shirabo where life and death were out of his control, Taoist Gu Hong fought for tens of thousands of years. In the end, he came to a realization at the last moment. He knew that he would die without a grave if he continued like this. He quickly used all sorts of methods and clones to escape the battle. He returned to his cave abode and tried his best to protect the area around his cave abode. Because of this, he missed the final battle between the 7 saints and the entire process of the destruction of the world. He only knew that the malevolent aura in the world was getting stronger and stronger. The shaking of the world was also getting more and more intense. Finally, with a loud bang, the entire world shattered. Boundless shockwaves engulfed him and the land that he had protected for millions of miles. Along with the land that he had protected, he began to drift along with the shockwaves like leaves in a tsunami. In the process, due to the impact of the shockwaves and the tremendous destruction, the land that he had protected was slowly shaved off. In the end, after tens of thousands of years, when the shockwaves completely calmed down, the world had become similar to what it was now. The land that had a radius of a few million kilometers had also become a few 100,000 kilometers. As for Yi Futian himself, he had gained enlightenment during the great calamity of the destruction of the world. He had finally broken through the innate Grand Luo realm that he had been unable to break through for a long time and became a demi-saint. That was right. In the process, Luo Fan had also learned about the division of cultivation realms among the cultivators on Earth during the era of the saints. The previous realms were no different from the division of cultivation realms in the future or the cultivation era. In general, it could be divided into 4 stages. The first stage was before immortality. The second stage was immortality, which was the innate golden core. The third stage was the pure yang level, which was equivalent to the innate golden core. The fourth stage was the 5 cheese unifications after the third stage, and eventually became the innate grand luo realm. Apart from that, there was also the 5th stage of cultivation that did not exist in the future. However, the 5th stage was completely different from the 5th stage of cultivation before the saints that Luo Fan knew from the Great Tianyuan world. In other words, the 5th stage back then was not the perishing realm, void comprehension, Tao unification, transcendence, or Tao venerable realm. It was another division, a division known as the demi-saint realm. In other words, after a cultivator surpassed the innate grand luo realm, if he gained enlightenment and broke through again, he would become a demi-saint and step into the last realm before the saints. Due to various opportunities, old Taoist Gu Hong finally broke through the innate grand luo realm and achieved the demi-saint realm when the world was destroyed. Of course, the demi-saint realm was only a realm. However, the gap between the realms was extremely huge. Some demi-saints were only a step away from becoming saints and could easily crush millions of demi-saints who had just broken through. Some demi-saints could only crush innate grand luo realm cultivators easily. At most, they were hundreds or thousands of times stronger than innate grand luo realm cultivators. Therefore, the demi-saints divided the demi-saint realm into several realms. They were divided into 5 small realms, namely beginner, initial, intermediate, advanced, and peak. It was similar to the 5 realms of perishing realm, void comprehension, Tao unification, transcendence, and Tao venerable realm in the Great Tianyuan world. However, it made it easier for Luo Fan to switch between realms. At this very moment, old Taoist Gu Hong had just entered the beginner realm and could only be said to have barely become a demi-saint. I see. May I know what technique you are cultivating? Luo Fan was curious when he heard that old Taoist Gu Hong had broken through during the calamity of the world's destruction and could not help but ask. If such a question was asked at any other time, it would naturally be extremely rude and could even be said to be disrespectful to old Taoist Gu Hong. However, from old Taoist Gu Hong's narration, Luo Fan knew that in the cultivation world before this era, the atmosphere of communication was extremely prosperous. There was no atmosphere of being selfish like in the future. It was very common for cultivators to exchange techniques with one another. There were even times when 2 cultivators who were complete strangers would bump into each other on the road. Once they felt something, they would directly communicate with each other about their own fundamental cultivation techniques. For Luo Fan, this kind of atmosphere was both surprising and reasonable. Naturally, he was surprised because this kind of atmosphere was completely different from the normal cultivation atmosphere that he had seen in the past. What made him feel reasonable was that he completely understood the reason behind it. After all, cultivation was an extremely personal matter. For any cultivator, even if they obtained the strongest technique, could they reach the peak in the end. To achieve supreme magical power, they would have to rely on their own efforts. If it was a foolish living being, even if they obtained the cultivation technique of a sage, even if they obtained the supreme Tao technique, they could still achieve nothing in the end. Under such circumstances, even if they told others about their own cultivation technique, it would not matter. If others knew that his cultivation method would put him in danger, then it could only mean that his cultivation method still had a weakness. That cultivation method was not perfect enough. Wouldn't it be perfect to let them know what he needed to make up for in the future? Of course, anyone with a bit of rationality would know what was the best choice to make. However, it was obvious that it was quite difficult for such an ideal situation to appear. For the world to be like this before the Primordial era, this made Luo Fan even more curious about that era. He also felt an indescribable sense of fondness towards that era, even though he knew that it was because of that era that the conflict occurred. It caused the world to collapse and the universe to become like this, resulting in the reincarnation of an era every 6 billion years. Taoist Gu Hong did not mind Luo Fan's question at all. After hearing Luo Fan's words, he answered without hesitation, "I cultivate the heart giving birth to all things." It is a cultivation technique that I learned from the wholehearted ceremony of the Worshipping Heart sect. It is the path of killing 3 corpses. There is no need to keep this a secret. However, he directly told Luo Fan about the method he cultivated, the source of this method, and the path he had taken without holding anything back. Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but praise inwardly. "I see. Then how many corpses have you killed?" "I am ashamed. I only barely became a quasi-sage. It is considered a beginner. Even though I learned about human corpses, I have yet to kill them. If I were to chop this corpse out, I would have long stepped into the initial realm." Old Taoist Gu Hong sighed. "In that case, the 3 corpses that you have killed should be the 3 corpses of heaven, earth, and human. This kind of corpses is much more difficult than normal. It is already very impressive to have achieved what you have today." Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but praise. In fact, Luo Fan wasn't completely clueless about the method of killing 3 corpses. In fact, in his memory, because Pangu's primordial spirit used his memory to create countless techniques, there were many methods of killing 3 corpses. Back then, when he had split his doppelgangers in the Earth's universe, he had even created a brand new method to split his doppelgangers based on these methods. Therefore, when he heard Taoist Gu Hong mention human corpses, he immediately guessed what kind of 3 corpses he was killing. He also understood how difficult it was for him to become a sage by killing 3 corpses. The method of killing 3 corpses was a mysterious method of becoming a sage. This method required one to kill the 3 existences of a cultivator and turn them into 3 corpses. Then, the cultivator would combine the 3 corpses into one's own body and obtain unparalleled power. With this, the cultivator would break through the barrier of the sage realm and become a sage. Though this method would ultimately change the cultivator's personality and was not something Luo Fan would choose, he had to admit that there was something profound about it. The 3 corpses that this method could kill only need to be 3 existences of a tripod. It was determined by the cultivator's situation and not fixed. For example, some people could kill good, evil, and self. Some people could be the 3 corpses of heaven, earth, and human. Some could be the 3 corpses of yin, yang, and chaos. Some could be the 3 corpses of beauty, ugliness, and mediocrity. There were all sorts of strange things. Among them, although the method of killing 3 corpses was not the most difficult, it was still one of the most difficult methods. The more difficult it was to kill 3 corpses, the more powerful the cultivator would be after they fused the 3 corpses into one. In the end, the cultivator would have a higher chance of breaking through the barrier of the sage realm and becoming a sage. Therefore, the more confident a person was in their talent and comprehension, the more difficult the method of cultivating 3 corpses would be. It was because he understood this that Luo Fan felt such admiration for Taoist Gu Hong's method of cultivating 3 corpses. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Taoist Gu Hong could not help but sigh. Although the future of this method might be good, the difficulty of cultivating it is simply too shocking. Although I can sense the location of the human corpses, it is still too far for me to kill them. I can't see any hope at all. Moreover, I lack the most important item for killing the corpses. I'm about to stop at this initial stage. Hearing Taoist Gu Hong's words, Luo Fan naturally knew that he was speaking the truth. The path of killing 3 corpses was an extremely difficult path to walk. If one wanted to reduce the difficulty, one had to find a treasure that could store the 3 corpses. If one could find a suitable treasure, it could even reduce the difficulty of killing 3 corpses by 1,000,000 times. However, if one could not find a treasure and could only rely on one's comprehension to kill 3 corpses, one might succeed in the end, but the difficulty would be at least 1,000,000 times greater than finding a suitable treasure. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 904. Generally speaking, those treasures were magic treasures that surpassed the great perfection level. However, not all magic treasures at the great perfection level were suitable for them. Normally, the best choice would be the mysterious magic treasures that were formed naturally and were known as primordial spiritual treasures. Even if there were no mysterious magic treasures that were formed naturally, they had to be refined using the corpse-splitting technique. Only magic treasures that surpassed the great perfection level could achieve this. However, it was obvious that primordial spiritual treasures that were formed naturally were hard to come by. Whether it was a perfect world or a magnificent place like the Great Tianyuan world, such primordial spiritual treasures were extremely rare. There were only a few dozen of them at most. For ordinary cultivators, such treasures were obviously not something they could look forward to. Therefore, for most cultivators, what they could really look forward to was a magic treasure that surpassed the great perfection level that was refined using the corpse-splitting technique. However, using the corpse-splitting technique to refine a magic treasure into a magic treasure that surpassed the great perfection level was as difficult as a cultivator becoming a sage to be. Therefore, for ordinary sage to be who had just entered the realm, it would be better to cultivate out of thin air and work hard to create the 3 corpses out of thin air instead of refining a magic treasure for the 3 corpses. Moreover, by creating the 3 corpses out of thin air, one's realm would be more stable. One would not need to spend too much time to stabilize the new realm. However, this did not mean that the 3 corpses magic treasure had to be a primordial spiritual treasure. It did not mean that the magic treasure refined using the 3 corpses magic treasure was useless. On the contrary, it was the existence of such a technique that made the world. All kinds of organizations such as sects, clans, and sects had the foundation to exist. This was because as long as there was an organization, the sage-to-be who already had magic treasures for the 3 corpses would be able to continuously refine magic treasures that other cultivators use for the corpse-splitting technique. In this way, after countless years of accumulation, the organization would naturally not lack such magic treasures. The cultivators in the organization would not have a hard time advancing due to the lack of magic treasures. Regarding this point, Luo Fan could deduce it with just a little deduction. However, the basis of his deduction was still the 3 corpses technique in his mind, but it might not necessarily be the same as the 3 corpses technique in the universe on Earth. Therefore, although he had already deduced this, Luo Fan still suppressed the doubts in his mind and tried to probe with words. Old Taoist Guhong wasn't very vigilant against Luo Fan. Luo Fan's probing words allowed him to easily obtain what he wanted to know. He understood that the 3 corpses execution method in the Earth universe was no different from the 3 corpses execution method in his memory. The magic treasures required were also the same. Finally, he could not help but ask his doubts. Fellow Taoist Guhong are from the Heart Worship sect. This was the doubts that Taoist Guhong had ye. However, Taoist Guhong did not. Taoist Zhou Taoist treasure sect. Taoist Gu Taoist treasure sect of saints. Spirit sect Dao sect for Taoist saint as well. As saints as Taoist sect. Magic sect saints sect. Even if these saints spent 1,000th or 10,000th of their time to refine their magic treasure, it would be enough for Heart Worship sect to accumulate quite a number of magic treasures. Moreover, these saints would not spend such a short amount of time refining magic treasures. Many of them were loyal to the sect. However, a quasi-sage who couldn't see any hope of becoming a sage would definitely put all his life into refining this corpse-slaying magical treasure. As long as there were 1 or 2 quasi-sages, the Heart Worship sect would be able to accumulate several corpse-slaying magical treasures. With such a foundation and such conditions, Taoist Guhong was clearly the last person in the Heart Worship sect. How could he possibly lack a corpse-severing magical treasure? How could he not be able to break through to the minor accomplishment realm just because he could not find any magic treasures? Hearing Luo Fan's doubts, Taoist Guhong's expression changed slightly. After a long time, he sighed and said, "Fellow Taoist, you might not know this. Although Heart Worship Sect has more than 30 magic treasures for corpse slaying, they were all at the headquarters. They disappeared along with the destruction of heaven and earth. It is impossible to find them." "I see." Luo Fan came to a sudden realization after hearing Taoist Gu Hong's words. It turned out that although he was the last person in the Heart Worship Sect, he did not go to the Heart Worship Sect's headquarters at the last moment because he had too much confidence in the Heart Worship Sect. Instead, he came to his own cave abode to protect the world that he felt he needed to protect. Under such circumstances, the headquarters of the Heart Worship Sect had disappeared without a trace due to the destruction of the world. Because of the disappearance of the headquarters of the Heart Worship Sect, he had also lost the way to obtain the corpse-slaying magic treasure. This was the reason for the current situation. Taoist Gu Hong seemed to have remembered his destroyed sect. For a moment, he was in a daze and fell into an inexplicable melancholy. Seeing Taoist Gu Hong's reaction, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Living beings who survived the destruction of heaven and earth were fortunate to be able to escape from the calamity of heaven and earth. However, at the same time, they were also unlucky. This was because they had to bear the pain of losing everything in the world that they were familiar with disappearing. Although Taoist Gu Hong was only a projection of the real Taoist Gu Hong, his memories and actions were as real as ever, making it difficult for anyone to treat him as a mere projection. Even Luo Fan was a little dazed for a moment. However, this kind of trance only appeared for a moment. Very soon, he had already completely dispelled this trance, and his entire mind had once again returned to a stable and unmoving state. His final goal on the Era Bridge was the Era Vortex at the center. He wanted to walk the path of Tao integration or transcendence to see what the hidden Almighty was up to. This kind of thinking was not something that could be influenced by any emotions, and it was not something that could be eliminated by any existence. Even if Taoist Gu Hong was so real that he could not tell if he was real or fake, he would not be swayed by it at all. He would not change his mind because of it. Even after he destroyed the projection of the era, he would occasionally think of Taoist Gu Hong. Even so, he would only feel regretful, but he would not regret what he had done. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan let out a sigh and said to Taoist Gu Hong, "I've been bothering you for too long. I still need to look for some friend from back then, so I won't disturb you any further." Meanwhile, when Luo Fan set foot on this land, several days had passed. In terms of time in the Earth's cosmos, he had wasted tens of thousands of days, which was equivalent to decades, since he had obtained what he wanted. Now that he knew what the Earth's cosmos was like before the Primordial era, there was no need for him to stay any longer. Therefore, he casually gave an excuse to bid farewell to Taoist Gu Hong. Taoist Gu Hong was a little disappointed when he heard Luo Fan's words. He said, "Since you're leaving, I won't keep you any longer. I won't keep you any longer. I only hope that you can find your friends as soon as possible." Luo Fan was the first cultivator that Taoist Gu Hong had encountered since the world shattered. Furthermore, Luo Fan was a quasi-sage cultivator that was stronger than him. Naturally, he wanted to communicate with Luo Fan more, and even hoped to receive Luo Fan's guidance so that he could improve his cultivation. However, Luo Fan had said that he wanted to find his friend, so he naturally couldn't say anything else. Could he say that his friend had most likely died in the great calamity of the world's destruction, and that it would be useless for him to look for him? So, it was better for him to stay here. Let's cultivate together and progress together. Words like that, if he were to really say it out loud, what awaited him would perhaps be the situation of falling out with Luo Fan. Therefore, Taoist Gu Hong directly said those words. Luo Fan felt somewhat guilty in front of old Taoist Gu Hong. He sighed, and after greeting Taoist Gu Hong, he lifted his feet and left the continent. His figure appeared in the void, and he turned around to look at the arc-like continent that was wrapped in a mysterious light in the void. He sighed again. It's a pity that the conflict between us can't be resolved. Otherwise, I would be a friend that I could confide in. Luo Fan sighed. After sighing, he directly teleported through the void. In an instant, he had traveled hundreds of millions of light years and arrived at a place of nothingness. In this primordial era projection, there was someone who was many times more powerful than Luo Fan. It was someone who was equivalent to a convergence cultivator. In other words, according to the division of realms before the primordial era on Earth, there was someone who was at the intermediate level of a quasi-saint and had cut off two separations. Beginner, initial, intermediate, advanced, and peak respectively corresponded to the 5 realms of destruction: void enlightenment, convergence cultivator, transcendence, and Tao sovereign. According to Taoist Guhong, beginner quasi-saint was someone who had just comprehended the 3 separations and had yet to cut them off. Initial was to cut off one of the separations, intermediate was to cut off 2 of the separations, and advanced was to cut off 3 of the separations. Peak was a realm where one could become a sage at any time by fusing 3 separations into one's body. Of course, this was only in theory. In reality, there might not even be 1 in a billion who could fuse 3 separations into one's body and become a sage. A powerful existence that was equivalent to a convergence cultivator was obviously a quasi-saint who had cut off 2 separations. Unless Luo Fan was tired of living and wanted to die, he would never dare to provoke such an existence. Therefore, after so many stages, he had accumulated the method to defeat the strongest expert of this era projection in order to trigger a reaction from the projected will of this era and find a location of the projected will of this era. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan had no choice but to choose another method. Fortunately, although he had only used the method mentioned above to find the strongest expert in the thousands of stages, he had also accumulated some inexplicable intuition because he had passed too many stages. This intuition allowed him to discover the position that had the closest connection with the projected will of this era, apart from the strongest expert. Such a position must exist. The projected will of this era was formed naturally. It would not be like a man-made object that faced the entire Earth in a smooth and balanced manner. As long as it was not smooth and balanced, there would naturally be a position that had a closer connection with the projected will of this era, while some would be more distant. In comparison, such a position that had the closest connection naturally existed, and the void that Luo Fan had arrived at was such a position. Floating in the void, Luo Fan's eyes locked on the position that had the closest connection with the projected will of this era. His face showed a calm expression as if he had everything under control. In fact, this position was not empty. Instead, an inexplicable mass of darkness existed there. This darkness was many times darker than the other parts of the void. The other parts of the void were dark because there was no light shining in them, so no one could sense them, which was why they appeared dark. However, the darkness here seemed to emit black light, darkness that could devour all light. This darkness, at first glance, it seemed to be mixed with the surrounding void, but as long as one observed carefully, one would know. The darkness here was different from the other voids. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's consciousness, which had been refined countless times, became many times stronger than before. His perception, which had been enhanced by an unknown amount of mysteries, surged out, crossed the void, and directly enveloped the darkness. After his changed perception, it already had the power of the various combinations of powers in the past. The functions of the various combinations of powers, such as analytical waves and probing waves, had long been integrated into this perception. At this moment, he only needed to wrap his perception around the darkness, and there was an endless amount of information naturally transmitted through his perception into his mind. This information did not only include the various forms of the darkness, all sorts of properties, including countless mysteries related to the darkness, and even countless mysteries related to the darkness' original form, the darkness' possible future development, and the darkness' final destination, continuously surged into his mind and mind. He sensed the countless pieces of information. A smile gradually appeared on Luo Fan's face. This dark thing was none other than the shadow of a sage. That's right, This was a shadow left behind by one of the 7 sages who had caused the entire world to shatter into countless fragments. It had existed since the calamity of the world's destruction, when the entire world was shattered into countless fragments, forming the vast and boundless universe that it was now. Even after hundreds of millions of years, it was still floating in this universe, and had even formed an extremely close connection with the projection of the world's will of this era. Although it was just a formless shadow, a shadow cast on the ground by the light that shone on the sage, it already contained endless mysteries. The principles contained within it were so profound that even Luo Fan found it incomprehensible and unfathomable. Moreover, due to the accumulation of hundreds of millions of years, it contained endless power. In terms of pure quantity, this power was not much weaker than the intermediate quasi-sages that Luo Fan did not dare to provoke in the Primordial era's projection. Such an existence was currently floating in front of Luo Fan. To him, this was simply a great opportunity, making him feel that his luck was off the charts. The sages were existences that Luo Fan could not comprehend at all. How powerful were the sages? What kind of magical powers did they possess? Apart from the basic immortality, eternity, and the ability to walk freely in the state of chaos, Luo Fan had no understanding of them at all. Although the shadow of the sages was merely a shadow, the fact that it could remain for such a long time, absorb endless power, and evolve to this stage showed that the shadow of the sages contained some, even if it was very, very little of the mysteries related to the sages. No matter how insignificant these mysteries were, they were, after all, related to the supreme realm of the sages. For any cultivator who had not become a sage, these mysteries were extremely precious mysteries. Even a peak quasi-sage who had fused 3 corpses into one would not be an exception, not to mention the current Luo Fan. Therefore, after discovering the truth of this dark existence, Luo Fan was filled with indescribable ecstasy. However, he had strong self-control, which was why he seemed to be only slightly happy. With this thing, even if I have to waste 1,000 years here, it will definitely be worth it. Such a thought echoed in his mind. The 1,000 years mentioned here did not refer to the 1,000 years in the Earth's universe outside, but the 1,000 years on the bridge of times. If converted to the Earth's universe outside, it would be as long as 10 million years. For the sake of this sage's shadow, Luo Fan was willing to give up 10 million years. From this, it could be seen how important this thing was to Luo Fan. He even had a ridiculous feeling that as long as he could fully obtain the mysteries of the shadow, it would not be a pity for him to stop here and completely give up this doppelganger. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Without hesitation, Luo Fan raised his hand and covered the darkness. Hundreds of thousands of tiny forces were instantly transformed by him and directly rushed out of his palm. In the void, under the control of his senses, they were outlined, twisted, and combined at an astonishing speed. In the blink of an eye, they formed an extremely complicated and mysterious, huge formation in the void. This formation did not rely on the power of the Bridge of Times, nor was it like other formations that combined the infinite power and power of the void outside. On the contrary, it completely isolated the formation from all connections with the outside world, forming a completely independent space inside the formation. This independence even cut off perception and vision. When the formation was activated, the formation and the sage's shadow inside, it completely disappeared in front of Luo Fan and from his senses. He could only discover that the formation still existed by relying on the connection of power. Welcome. Your support is my greatest motivation. Extraordinary chaos. Welcome readers to log in. Chapter 905. After the formation was completely formed, Luo Fan raised his foot and took a step forward. Through the extremely close connection between his mind and the power that formed the formation, he directly passed through the mysterious formation and stepped into it. This formation could completely isolate the inside from the outside, and even Luo Fan's perception and sight could be completely isolated. If he wanted to comprehend the mysteries of the saint's shadow that was wrapped in it, It was naturally impossible for him to do so outside of the formation. Although Luo Fan could also perceive the various mysteries of the Saint's shadow through the connection between himself and the power, there was still a layer of obstruction after all. Perceiving it was naturally much more difficult than perceiving it directly. If he wanted to gain something, he would need to put in a lot more effort. If there was no other way, he would naturally accept it. However, as long as he took a step into it, he would be able to change the reality, so he naturally had no reason not to do so. After stepping into the formation, what Luo Fan saw was a void that was neither too big nor too small, and it was about tens of thousands of meters wide. In this void, the Saint's shadow was only a small piece, and it looked like a normal person's shadow. It floated in the middle of the void, and apart from this shadow, there was nothing else in the void. In fact, there were no laws or anything like vitality in it. This formation could completely isolate all connections. Naturally, it had the function of separating the void and expanding a void within it. It was very natural for it to have such a void appearance at this moment. Looking at the shadow in front of him, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, arriving next to the shadow. When he was within 3 feet of the shadow, he felt a mysterious aura surging towards him. This kind of aura was very mysterious. Being wrapped by this aura, Luo Fan's mind shook violently. It was as if the origin of his life was under an unimaginable pressure. It was as if the thing in front of him was an existence far more noble than him by countless times. He was personally experiencing the mysteries of this thing. Even the origin of his life was under pressure that could destroy him. Sensing this aura, Luo Fan's eyes showed a look of shock, but also a look of realization. Naturally, they were shocked because this was just a shadow. It actually possessed such might, causing him to feel ashamed of his own inferiority before it. He felt that he was countless times weaker than it. What made him even more certain was that the shadow was the Saint's shadow. Only a supreme existence that was related to a saint could produce such an unbelievable power, and only such power could exist. Only then would he be worthy of the Saint's shadow. However, it was only a shadow. Even if it was extremely mysterious, even if the power it contained was comparable to the power of the Tao integration realm, that is, the power of a powerful existence in the intermediate tier of Sage to Be, it was not much of a threat to Luo Fan without the control of a complete willpower. Without a specific target, the willpower could not be condensed, no matter how strong it was. Luo Fan could also find thousands of ways to resist the damage it would cause to himself. As the thought flashed in his mind, his figure changed slightly. In an instant, the terrifying might emitted by the shadow was completely dispersed, and his body and mind returned to peak condition. He raised his hand and patted it gently. Hundreds of thousands of strands of power instantly rushed out of his palm. As soon as these powers rushed out of his palm, they began to change violently in the void. Any strand of power began to connect with other powers according to some extremely mysterious trajectory. Soon, they had condensed into a transparent palm that was neither too big nor too small in front of him. It was just big enough to hold the shadow. As soon as the palm was formed, it gave off a feeling that it could control everything and see through everything. Any living creature who saw this palm would know that it was a supreme existence that could obtain all mysteries. This palm, it was none other than the combination of powers that Luo Fan had specifically created based on his perception of the Saint's shadow. It could carry his will and was the simplest and most direct way to comprehend the Saint's shadow. Of course, although this power combination was condensed from hundreds of thousands of different powers, it was created by Luo Fan in a hurry. However, after all, it was created by Luo Fan in a hurry. As such, its function was extremely simple, and it did not even push its single function to the extreme. However, at this moment, it was enough. At the very least, it was many times better than when he used his perception to comprehend the Saint's shadow. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed at the shadow. In the blink of an eye, it had wrapped around the shadow and held it in his palm. The power combination carried his will, just like his body. When a hand grabbed the saint's shadow, Luo Fan felt as if he had directly swallowed the saint's shadow into his body. In an instant, an indescribable feeling was transmitted into his mind from the point of contact between the palm and the shadow. The feeling could not be described with words. As he was enveloped by this feeling, Luo Fan felt as if he had suddenly been struck by an extremely high and deep realm. Indeed, he had been struck by a realm. Almost at the same time, he felt that his mentality, his perspective, his worldview, and his understanding of the universe had undergone an earth-shattering change. In a trance, he seemed to have become an extremely powerful and mysterious existence. It was as if he had stepped into a brand new world that he had never dared to imagine in the past. In this world, all his desires and emotions as a normal living being had completely disappeared. What remained was a grand and lofty will that was extremely close to the great Tao and extremely close to chaos. What he saw, what he heard, and what he thought was completely different from before. At that moment, the matter of comprehending the mysteries of his cultivation from the saint shadow that he desperately wanted seemed so insignificant at this moment. It was almost unable to arouse any fluctuations in him, unable to produce fluctuations that made him take action. It was not that he had completely forgotten his previous desires, nor was it that he had completely lost his memories. His memories were not lost at all. He completely remembered everything. He remembered all his experiences after stepping on the bridge of times. He remembered that he had a clone in the Earth universe, a main body in the Primordial world, and a clone in the Great Tianyuan world. He was also completely aware of what his main body, clone, and clone were doing and pursuing. However, all of this was so insignificant to him at this moment. It was so boring. He would rather be in a daze. He did not want to waste any energy to complete his previous pursuits. Although it seemed that he could completely break the barrier between the peak of the void and lightning realm and the Tao integration realm with just a thought, allowing him to completely step into the Tao integration realm. This process lasted for an unknown period of time. It seemed as if hundreds of millions of years had passed. Even Luo Fan felt that his memories as a normal living being had gradually become blurry. He had almost thought that he was born in this state. Just when he was in such a profound state, a warning sign that his life was in danger rose in his heart. Along with this warning, a desire to survive abruptly erupted from the source of his life, shaking his seemingly unchanging will, making him slowly, reluctantly break away from this mysterious state. The moment he broke away from this state, inside the array, Luo Fan, who was floating next to the sage's shadow, suddenly trembled. His originally deep eyes trembled. His originally deep and empty eyes suddenly became extremely dim. Cold sweat broke out all over his body in an instant, and his face became extremely pale. That was close. Luo Fan spat out these two words as he retreated frantically. The huge palm that he had released earlier, which had wrapped around the sage's shadow, had already turned into nothingness. It had left the shadow and floated in front of him. At this very moment, only 10 seconds had passed since he had grabbed the saint's shadow. All the power in his body had been depleted. His soul, his mind, and his consciousness, his perception, and even his life essence had been consumed to the point where only a tiny, insignificant amount of power was left. Even his physical strength had become so weak that he had almost lost the ability to survive in the void. In just a short 10 seconds, 1/6 of the time it took to snap a finger, his power, body, soul, mind, and everything else, which was at the peak of the void and lightning realm and was only one step away from the Tao integration realm, had been depleted to such an extent. This was so strange and terrifying that Luo Fan could not help but feel a lingering fear. Fortunately, my desire to survive is strong enough. Otherwise, such a thought flashed through his mind. As soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he felt dizzy and even felt like he was about to fall asleep. Naturally, this was not because he was afraid, but because his soul, willpower, and consciousness had been depleted to the extreme. He could not even support a few thoughts that flashed through his mind. Knowing that this was the most dangerous moment, Luo Fan's mind flashed. The mysterious array that enveloped the sage's shadow suddenly shook, and the power that originally existed in it, which could adjust the flow of time, was activated to the extreme. In an instant, the flow of time in the array increased to an unbelievable level, reaching tens of thousands of times faster than the outside world. This array had been set up by Luo Fan to isolate the connection between the sage's shadow and the primordial projection in the outside world. Its isolation effect was naturally not limited to the void, power, rules, and nomological laws. Time was also included in its isolation range. After all, he could not completely understand how much connection there was between the sage's shadow and the primordial projection in the outside world. If he wanted to completely isolate the two in order to prevent the primordial projection from reacting unfavorably to him when he comprehended the shadow, he naturally had to consider everything that he could isolate. This clearly included time. Since he could isolate time, it meant that the inside and outside of the array were in completely independent space-time. Since it was completely independent, it was not surprising that he could adjust the flow of time in this space-time and increase the flow of time. Although a mere thought had already changed the array, Luo Fan still felt an almost irresistible wave of dizziness suddenly attack him. He almost fell into a deep slumber. Fortunately, he knew very well that if he were to fall asleep like this, he might only wake up after hundreds of millions of years. He gathered his remaining willpower to resist the invasion of the dizziness, barely keeping his mind awake. Afterwards, he directly sat cross-legged in the void and began to activate the peak of the great perfection of the void comprehending realm. This allowed his body to produce power at an extremely shocking speed, replenishing the power that he had exhausted. This allowed his mind, spirit, will, and origin of life to recover at the fastest speed possible through this process. Luo Fan's power, spirit, will, origin of life, and mind were far too vast. This was because this vastness allowed him to recover at the fastest speed possible. By the time he had fully recovered and returned to his peak state, 100,000 years had passed. Fortunately, he had managed to activate the array formation's ability to adjust the flow of time before he started cultivating. Compared to the projection of the primordial era, 100,000 years had passed. Compared to the primordial projection, this 100,000 years was only a year, which was still within his acceptable range. If he had not had that last thought and wasted 100,000 years, it would have been equivalent to 1 billion years in the outside world. Almost 1/5 of the age of Dharma ending would have passed, which was almost fatal. When he came back to his senses, Luo Fan's eyes were filled with lingering fear, but also joy. He raised his head and looked at the saint's shadow, which had not changed at all compared to 100,000 years ago. He let out a long sigh. I didn't think that just a shadow would already be like this. What kind of existence is a saint? In the past, when Luo Fan was still in the innate Zenith Luo realm, he still dared to speculate about the power of a saint because of his confidence in himself. Even though he knew that a saint was an existence that he could not understand, he would still occasionally imagine what a saint would look like in the depths of his heart, how their abilities would be. However, the more his cultivation realm increased, the more he realized that his imagination was superficial. The more he dared not guess what a saint looked like and what kind of power he had. But no matter how high he speculated about the height of a saint or how strong he imagined the power of a saint's abilities, at this moment, he still realized that he was still a frog at the bottom of a well. He still underestimated a saint countless times. In other words, no matter how high a position he placed a saint in at this moment, he still realized that the position he placed a saint in was still countless times lower than a saint. The feeling that he felt when he covered the saint's shadow with a palm-shaped power combination for 10 moments. It was the feeling that the shadow had somehow carried with it a trace of an insignificant saint's that was pressed on his will through the combination of power. That feeling was not the feeling of a saint, nor was it the feeling that he had directly incarnated into the saint who had left this shadow. Instead, It was the extremely broken feeling that was contained in the trace of a saint's will. It was the mental projection of a saint that had been weakened by countless times. In a broad sense, it could also be called the feeling of a saint. However, compared to the feeling of a real saint, it had been simplified by countless times. Compared to incarnating into a saint, it was even simplified by countless times. However, for Luo Fan, who had already reached the peak of the perfect void comprehension realm and was only one step away from breaking through the void comprehension realm to become a path integration cultivator, it was already an unbearably powerful and unimaginable existence. The traceable did not need Luo Fan to activate it. It directly pressed on his will like a mountain, and, with the help of his will, it extracted everything in Luo Fan's body to maintain the mental projection of a saint that was contained in it. With Luo Fan's vast and limitless power, which was enough to easily crush the will of a cultivator who had not reached the consummate stage of the void enlightening realm, his mind and will that had already been tempered to become incomparably tough and stable, his unbreakable perception that had endless wonderful uses, his divine soul that was already so powerful that it was not much different from his physical body, and so on and so forth. Any one of these could almost make him an invincible existence, but he could only endure the mental projection for 10 seconds before he was directly exhausted. From this, it could be seen how incredible the mental projection was in that instant. The various feelings that Luo Fan had in those 10 moments were not the feelings of a real saint. Instead, they were mental projections that had been distorted and deformed after he had forcibly comprehended it with his own realm. This mental projection was already very different from a real mental projection, but some characteristics of a real mental projection could still be seen. In fact, this distortion of the mental projection was like a kindergarten child using his own method to understand a difficult problem like calculus. Naturally, there was a huge deviation from the real answer. It was precisely because of this huge deviation that Luo Fan had that inexplicable feeling. It was as if he could easily obtain the answer to the question that he had spent tens of thousands of years and hundreds of millions of years pursuing with just a single thought. It was also this deviation that made him fall into the mental projection's disdain for those who were below the saint realm. It was the kind of contempt that made him feel that apart from himself, everything else was like an ant, and there was no need to pay any attention to it. When he understood this, Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. It seems that I've thought of things too simply. As expected, it's not so easy to comprehend the profoundness of a saint's shadow. Such a thought appeared in his mind. Chapter 906. Faced with such a predicament, Luo Fan could not help but frown, and a sense of depression rose from his heart. Of course, although he was depressed, he did not have any thoughts of giving up. The shadow of the saint was right in front of him, and it contained traces of the saint's will. No matter how difficult it was to comprehend it, it was still easier than trying to comprehend the saint realm from nothing. In fact, he did not need to completely comprehend the mysteries within. As long as he could gain something, it would be enough for him to gain endless benefits. From the various feelings that had been produced when his willpower had carried the traces of the sage's mental strength, Luo Fan could clearly sense the mysteries of the Tao integration realm. The barrier between the peak of the void enlightenment realm and the Tao integration realm was insignificant to the remnant of the mental strength. However, breaking through this barrier and reaching the Tao integration realm was almost a piece of cake. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan, who had spent billions or trillions of years cultivating to comprehend the mysteries of heaven and earth and the truth of the universe in order to make progress bit by bit, give up on the sage's shadow, which could greatly reduce the difficulty of his cultivation? How could he set it aside just because he couldn't figure it out and couldn't find a way to comprehend it? With a thought, Luo Fan walked toward the sage's shadow, step by step. When he was closest to it, he was only a few feet away from the sage's shadow. However, because he had exhausted all his power, perception, mind, and soul in those 10 seconds, he had retreated quickly and had already retreated thousands of feet away. At this moment, he was still a distance away from the shadow. It was such a distance. Luo Fan walked for more than an hour. During this time, with every step he took, his perception was raised to the limit, sensing all the changes in his surroundings. He comprehended the process of approaching the sage's shadow and the impact that the sage's shadow had on him. Previously, he had been rather excited. Although he had not lost his vigilance, he had not focused all his attention on the sage's shadow. He had not been vigilant about the sage's shadow's impact on him. At this moment, after spending so much time walking the distance of 1,000 feet, he finally discovered many things that he had not discovered before. He discovered the impact that the sage's shadow had on his surroundings. The shadow seemed normal on the surface. On the surface, it looked normal, and it seemed that only those within a few feet of it would be affected by its aura. However, in reality, the influence of the sage's shadow was not limited to just a few feet. Instead, it seemed to be able to affect everything within its range from thousands of feet away or even further away. This kind of influence caused the space and time within this area to have some kind of subtle, indescribable distortion. This distortion was not only limited to laws, but also included time, space, and everything that existed within it. In this distortion, if Luo Fan closed his eyes, he would feel as if he was stepping into a brand new world. It was a completely different, perfect world. It was as if it had unknowingly broken away from the Earth's universe. The projection of the primordial era and the formation that he had specially built for this sage's shadow. The closer he got, the more obvious this feeling became. At the very beginning, it was only a few feet away. This feeling was already extremely strong, turning into the kind that he had felt at the beginning. It was as if his entire life source was under an unimaginable pressure, as if the thing in front of him was an existence that was countless times more noble than him. Even if he were to personally feel the mysteries of this thing, he would be overwhelmed. Even his life source was under a pressure that could destroy it. He had already felt this once before, and now that he felt it again, he had even more experiences. The pressure he felt on his life origin felt as if a huge world was pressing down on his life origin, putting pressure on his life origin. The feeling that this thing was countless times more noble than him was as if he was facing a lofty universe that was extremely vast. I see. This sage's shadow actually contains a trace of the unique charm of a sage. Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He did not get rid of the aura and just bathed in it. After thinking about it, he finally found the root cause of the misfortune that he had encountered before. It was that he had been too impatient. He had underestimated the power of this sage's shadow and underestimated it. When he arrived, he had hurriedly inserted his will into the shadow. Although he had the combination of power formed by hundreds of thousands of powers to carry his will, in essence, he had still inserted his will into the shadow. This way, there was no buffer at all, and he had directly suffered all the power of the shadow. Judging from the various situations before, this sage's shadow was not any weaker than the projection of the world's will in essence. This kind of existence came from the sage and carried a trace of the sage's will. So it had a moment's thought projection of the sage. Although it was similar in essence to the projection of the world's will, its form of existence was completely different from the projection of the world's will. Although the projection of the world's will was extremely powerful, and even a little bit of its power was enough to directly crush Luo Fan into powder, its form of existence was completely different from that of ordinary living creatures. Although it instinctively resisted, it could not completely target Luo Fan, and it had almost no ability to adapt. Therefore, it allowed Luo Fan to use the simplest method to completely understand all the mysteries within it, and then easily destroy it. However, the sage's shadow was completely different. Its form of existence, however, had a certain characteristic of living creatures. Even though there wasn't much of this characteristic, it was enough to mobilize its power and unleash divine might that was countless times more powerful than the projection of the world's will. Under such circumstances, it was clear that Luo Fan had to be even more cautious than when he faced the projected world's will in order to gain anything. However, he had recklessly invaded it with his will. Wasn't that equivalent to directly colliding with the projected world's will? How could he not suffer great losses, now that he had found the reason? Of course, he had a way to deal with the sage's shadow. He sat down cross-legged 3 feet away from the sage's shadow and slowly closed his eyes. He opened his mind completely and endured the powerful aura emitted by the sage's shadow without any resistance. This kind of aura exerted an extremely shocking pressure on him. Previously, when he didn't open his mind, the aura was extremely oppressive. His life essence trembled violently and was on the verge of collapse. At this moment, he opened his mind. That aura was even more convenient to invade. In an instant, that oppressive feeling skyrocketed by more than 100 times. However, although it had already skyrocketed by 100 times, the trembling of his life essence and the feeling that it was on the verge of collapse was still only on the verge of collapse. It still didn't collapse. It was as if his life essence was a kind of spring that could shrink with a gentle pressure. However, no matter how much force one exerted, as long as it didn't reach its limit, it would only shrink even shorter in the end. It wouldn't be able to directly collapse or damage the spring. Enduring such oppression, Luo Fan only felt that his mind was blank, and his ability to think had almost completely disappeared. Only an insignificant but unbreakable will of perseverance was left. In this process, Luo Fan completely lost his sense of time. In a trance, it seemed like countless years had passed, but also seemed like only a moment had passed. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly came back to his senses. He discovered that the aura that had almost caused his life essence to collapse seemed to no longer pose a threat to him. It couldn't make his thoughts almost disappear. His mind was blank. He didn't know when he had recovered his ability to think. When he came back to his senses, Luo Fan suddenly felt a sense of relief. A faint joy slowly appeared from nothing. It felt like he was gradually waking up from an extremely deep sleep and slowly recalling something that he knew before he fell asleep. It was enough to make him ecstatic. An inexplicable sense of satisfaction gradually spread in his mind and mind. After a while, he completely woke up. He opened his eyes and sensed slightly. He knew that the aura hadn't weakened in the slightest. It was still so incredible. It was still oppressing and affecting everything around it. The reason why his mind was blank and he almost couldn't think was because his endurance had greatly increased. The aura that could have had a huge impact on him previously, although he couldn't completely ignore it now, it no longer affected his thinking and mind. With a thought, he closed his mind again. The pressure instantly weakened by 100 times, reaching an almost undetectable level. This change caused a faint smile to appear on Luo Fan's face. In that instant, he felt like he had become stronger, something he had never felt before. This change was not in terms of power or cultivation level, but in his will, the source of his life and his will. However, the strengthening of his will, origin of life, and what was of great benefit to him. At the very least, after becoming stronger, it would be much easier for him to increase his cultivation. The bottlenecks and barriers in cultivation that he originally encountered would also be greatly weakened. How could he not be happy? The smile on his face lasted for a while before Luo Fan put it away. With a thought, he calculated slightly. In the end, he let out a long sigh. It turned out that more than 1,000,000 years had passed since he closed his eyes and endured the pressure of this aura. Even though the flow of time within the formation was 100,000 times faster than the outside world, it was still a full 10 years after such a long period of time. In addition to the 1 year he had spent recovering from his injuries, he had spent a total of 11 years in the projection of the Primordial era. Spending 11 years in a single checkpoint was the highest amount of time he had spent passing the 9,900 checkpoints. It could almost be said that he had spent the longest time in a checkpoint. Even so, he still did not step into the space-time where the projection of the world's will was located. He still had not found any clues on how to destroy the projection of the Primordial era. There was also the shadow of the saint that he needed to comprehend. Each of these required a long period of time. If this was the case, he did not know if another 11 years would be enough to destroy this primordial projection. It could be said that it was hard to predict how long it would take for him to pass. Although he had expected this, he could not help but sigh. After thinking for a while, he collected his thoughts and looked at the saint's shadow in front of him. At that moment, although he could already withstand the pressure from the aura emitted by the saint's shadow, he wanted to use his own will to withstand the trace of the saint's will that was contained within the saint's remnant thought for a split second. It was still impossible. The mental projection was still too profound and heavy for him. It was still beyond the limits of his understanding. If he used the combination of energy to carry his will to wrap around the shadow like before, the result would definitely be the same as before, falling into that incomparably mysterious state. He would be in a state that was difficult to control. Even if there was a difference, it would at most increase the amount of time he could endure it, from the original 10 seconds to 20 or 30 seconds. Such a difference was obviously meaningless to him. Moreover, most importantly, he was only lucky to be able to regain consciousness in 10 seconds. It was because his will to live was too strong, allowing him to break free at the last moment. If he tried again this time, he was not confident that he could break free before his limit. It was not because his will to live had weakened. It was because he could not be sure that his will to live would be effective every time. Since he could not do it directly, he could only use another method. This method was somewhat similar to the method he had used to comprehend the projected will of heaven and earth. However, it was naturally not exactly the same. With a thought, the power in his body divided into hundreds of thousands of strands and combined in front of him in an extremely mysterious and complicated way. In the blink of an eye, a colorless and transparent strange brilliance was formed. This brilliance was extremely mysterious and seemed to have an infinite substance. It was the only thing in this world that could exist since ancient times and could not be destroyed or affected by anything. However, it also seemed illusory. It was just an illusion of a living being. After the colorless and transparent brilliance was formed, Luo Fan's perception directly blasted out and fused with this strange brilliance. His original perception had already been formed by the combination of hundreds of thousands of strands of power. He had pushed all the power of that perception to the limit that it could reach, and it was even close to the perception of the Tao integration realm. At this moment, when it blasted into this brilliance, it instantly produced an extremely subtle fusion. In an instant, the two completely fused together and emitted a kind of willpower brilliance. Any living being that saw this kind of brilliance would be filled with an incomparably firm will, and their fighting spirit would greatly increase. The colorless and transparent strange brilliance was formed by the combination of hundreds of thousands of different powers. The perception was also formed by the combination of tens of thousands of different powers. After his cultivation realm improved, he once again refined his perception and increased the original tens of thousands of powers to hundreds of thousands of powers. Most of the powers in the two were the same. However, when the two fused together, the similar powers did not fuse together, and there were no abnormal effects due to the same powers. On the contrary, those powers belonged to their respective systems. They belonged to the power in the colorless and transparent brilliance, and they formed an inseparable and unbreakable whole with the other powers in the brilliance. The power that belonged to the perception also formed an inseparable whole with the other powers in the perception. The fusion of the two was the fusion of the two, and it could not affect the powers that formed the combination at all. The colorless and transparent strange brilliance was a kind of brilliance that supported the perception. After this brilliance fused with the perception, it would form an existence similar to willpower. This existence, similar to willpower, would have all the characteristics of willpower. If Luo Fan wanted to, it could even turn into another Luo Fan and form a perception clone. However, because the core of this existence was Luo Fan's perception, although it could obtain all the characteristics of willpower, its connection with Luo Fan was not very close. Or rather, its connection with Luo Fan's origin of life and his will was not very close. This result could be described as a metaphor. It was like the perception was a bridge that crossed the sea, while Luo Fan's own will was like a huge piece of land on the other side of the sea. The will formed from the colorless and transparent light, and perception was like an island on the other side of the sea. The island could have everything on the continent, and it could also obtain everything that could be obtained on the continent. However, if one wanted to transfer everything on the island to the continent, they could only do so through the bridge. If the continent did not agree, they could directly lock the bridge and completely cut off the things that they were unwilling to accept. This was the connection between the mysterious will formed from the perception and the strange brilliance and Luo Fan's own will. This was also the method that Luo Fan thought of to explore the mysteries of the Saint's Shadow. Chapter 907. It felt great to watch it without any advertisements. Using the willpower condensed from his perception as the core to carry the traces of the Saint's will in the Saint's Shadow, he would be able to sense the mental projection that existed in that instant, just like in those 10 or so moments tens of thousands of years ago. Absolute power. Moreover, because the connection with him was his perception, and he did not directly use his willpower to bear the remnant of the will, Luo Fan would not completely fall into that strange state, nor would he completely lose his sense of self. This was the method he thought of. Not only could he achieve the most direct perception of the various things in the Saint's Shadow, but at the same time he could also prevent his will from being completely affected by the mental projection, so he would not lose his sense of self. Since he had already made his decision, Luo Fan naturally would not hesitate. With a thought, the willpower condensed from his perception as the core suddenly shook and pounced towards the Saint's Shadow. Without any obstruction, it drilled into the Saint's Shadow. In an instant, the feeling that was almost exactly the same as when he directly carried the remnant of the will in the Black Shadow was instantly transmitted to Luo Fan's mind through his perception. It almost made Luo Fan completely lose himself in it and fall into a state of mind where he could not control himself. Fortunately, this was, after all, a feeling transmitted from his perception. Although it was unimaginably strong, it was not all of his willpower. After all, most of his willpower was still awake and was not affected. In an instant, his incomparably firm willpower instantly stabilized his mind, allowing his mind to maintain a clear state. Looking down from a high vantage point, he sensed the strange feeling transmitted from his perception. It was a supreme and noble way of thinking. In that way of thinking, everything in the universe was like an illusion, and even the most powerful cultivator was just an ant. She couldn't let him show any signs of being moved. So, the mentality of Saint is like this. In a trance, Luo Fan had an inexplicable realization. In the midst of this realization, he suddenly felt a sense of desolation, because he was the ant, the illusion that could not stop that kind of mentality at all, even if he knew what kind of existence that Saint was. As for who that Saint was, he did not have any intention to form a relationship with any saint. However, as a powerful cultivator who had cultivated for trillions of years, he was only a phantom and an ant in the eyes of others. This was clearly not a good feeling. However, this emotion did not reach the point where it could affect Luo Fan's mentality. Very soon, his mind returned to a calm state, and he began to use his powerful will to influence the Saint's Shadow through his perception, with that perception as the core of his will. Ever since the will entered the shadow, it had completely merged with the shadow. At this moment, even if it was Luo Fan himself, if not for the connection between them, he would not have been able to sense it. It was as if the will had become a part of the shadow, a part of the shadow. Although this situation was inconceivable, it was not out of Luo Fan's expectations, because he already knew. The power of the Saint's Shadow was far from what he could imagine. Even his own will could not fully activate the shadow, and it was almost devoured by the shadow instead. Naturally, the will that used perception as the core would not be able to activate the shadow either. Since he could not activate the shadow, he would naturally be devoured by the shadow instead. At this moment, what Luo Fan saw and felt was not fake. The will that used perception as the core had indeed merged with the shadow, and it had indeed been devoured by the shadow. It could be said that the will had become the shadow's will, and the connection between it and Luo Fan was only that bit of perception. Originally, if it was any other treasure, this would be equivalent to Luo Fan refining it and being able to control everything about it perfectly. However, the saint's shadow was different. There were traces of the saint's will within the shadow. This bit of will possessed unbelievable power. When Luo Fan's will that used perception as the core fused with it, it was like a drop of water falling into the ocean. It could not change the nature of the ocean, nor could it change the way the ocean flowed. As such, the result was obvious. Luo Fan wanted to command the will to think according to his thoughts through the connection with his perception, but he definitely could not command the will to think like he did at other times. It was extremely difficult. Even if he expended all of his will on it, it was like adding a little wave to the turbulent sea. It was extremely insignificant, and he could not make the will move according to him. Under such circumstances, the various thoughts that were transmitted through his perception and into his mind were still the same as before. However, it was still the same as before. There was no change at all. It was as if Luo Fan's frantic attempt to control his thoughts had completely fallen into thin air. This is indeed very difficult to succeed. Seeing this, Luo Fan finally confirmed his initial thoughts. Although he did not give up on the idea of continuing to influence the will, he focused more of his attention on the way of thinking that was transmitted through perception, trying his best to comprehend the various mysteries of this way of thinking. All sorts of mysteries. Previously, when he had directly touched the saint's shadow with his will, the reason why he had almost been completely drained in the short span of 10 seconds was not really because the saint's shadow would devour and absorb everything from him. Instead, it was because he had instinctively resisted the feeling that made him lose himself and completely lose himself during the process. In other words, the exhaustion was caused by his own instinctive resistance. In other words, if he had not resisted and allowed himself to be lost within, or if he could have suppressed his instincts to resist, the time when his will directly touched the shadow would not have been just 10 seconds. Of course, this was evidently impossible. Losing oneself within. It was like returning to heaven and earth, and it was no different from dying. As long as one was a living being, as long as they had the desire to live, they would definitely not give up resisting and allow themselves to be lost within. Even Luo Fan himself could not perfectly control this. But the situation at this moment was different. The will formed from the combination of perception and the strange colorless and transparent light was shockingly powerful, to the point where he could even treat it as a perception clone. If he unleashed its power, it could easily crush powerful emptiness enlightening realm cultivators. But it was not his foundation. When he decided to do so, he had already made up his mind to abandon it. Thus, he did not care about the will's life or death. He would not resist the will's complete integration into the shadow, nor would he resist the will's mysterious way of thinking. Thus, the amount of time he could endure the integration of the will into the shadow was not short. At this moment, although dozens of breaths had passed since he integrated the will into the shadow, he was still not exhausted. At most, the pressure on his will was getting stronger. But as long as he was willing, he could continue. In a situation where he had nothing to worry about. Luo Fan's understanding of the way of thinking that was transmitted through perception was naturally more detailed and complete. The way of thinking was carried by the strands of the saint's will, and it was a distorted projection of the saint's thoughts in that instant. Even if it was extremely distorted due to the limitations of his understanding, it still had its original form, and it contained countless mysteries that Luo Fan needed. Although the way of thinking was extremely mysterious and had reached a level that far exceeded the limits of Luo Fan's understanding, Luo Fan was after all standing at an extremely high altitude and looking down at it. As time passed, the secret of the way of thinking was gradually revealed. There were countless things that Luo Fan could not understand within the secrets of this way of thinking. This was inevitable. It was like a primitive man facing a computer. If he could find the right method, of course he could dismantle the computer into its components and even reassemble it, But to completely understand the secrets of each component was obviously impossible. Of course, there were things that he could not understand completely within the secrets of this way of thinking, and naturally, there were also things that he could slightly understand. Similarly, he was like a primitive man dismantling a computer. Perhaps he could not understand what the hard disk, motherboard, memory, graphics card, CPU, and other components were used for, but he could at least know that the computer case was used to store these components. At this moment, Luo Fan was like such a primitive man. With a thought, countless thoughts rushed up in his mind and suddenly condensed into an extremely mysterious pattern. This pattern was similar to a talisman, but it was billions of times more complicated and mysterious than a normal talisman. As soon as this pattern appeared, Luo Fan's mind was somewhat overwhelmed, and the crackling sounds were like thunder rumbling in his ears. It was as if his mind could not withstand the pressure of this pattern formed by the thoughts, and was about to collapse under this pressure. In a trance, Luo Fan seemed to understand something. With a thought, the perception that was connected to the will inside the shadow was instantly cut off, and the will inside the shadow was directly integrated into the shadow. The various feelings that were transmitted into Luo Fan's mind through the perception, which almost made him fall into a state of confusion, disappeared in an instant. In his mind instructs, in a second, there was only that incomparably complicated and mysterious strange pattern left. After everything disappeared, this strange pattern expanded violently. Not only did it wrap around his mind, but it also affected his perception and his spirit, causing his way of thinking to produce an extremely subtle feeling. What his ears heard, what his eyes saw, what his skin touched, what his nose smelled, and what his tongue felt, all of them underwent drastic changes. The various, incomparably real things that he had felt in the past instantly became illusory. In a trance, he seemed to be on a strange, barren planet, and this planet was passed through by an incomparably long and huge half-moon-shaped bridge. It was like a string of beads was strung on this bridge. Outside this planet, there were close to 10,000 planets strung on this bridge like a string of beads. Among them, there were 9,989 planets on one side of this planet. In addition, there were 9 planets on the other side of this planet. However, in addition to the difference in the number of planets on these two sides, there was also a big difference in their appearance. The 99,819 star beads were very clear, and one could see everything on them at a glance. On the other hand, where Luo Fan was standing and the 9 planets behind him were completely different. Those planets were blurry at this moment, as if they were covered by a layer of fog. They also seemed like phantoms that could disappear without a trace at any time. At the ends of this string of planets, which was relatively far away from him, it was a boundless starry sky, and on the other side, which was relatively close to him, was only 9 planets away from the end of the string of planets. It was a strange whirlpool, or rather, it was pitch black, the eye of the whirlpool and the center of the whirlpool. Apart from the center and the eye, everything else in the whirlpool was extremely vast. It directly affected the entire bridge and affected the other end of the bridge, which was further away from him. Along with the 9,999 planets and the bridge, it was in the middle of this huge whirlpool. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not understand that this was clearly the appearance of the Era Bridge in the galaxy? In other words, this appearance was clearly the true appearance of the Era Bridge at this moment. The bridge that strung the 9,999 planets like a string of beads was the Era Bridge, and the 9,999 planets were the planets in the Era whirlpool other than the 3 stars. So this is how I step into the Era whirlpool. No wonder the closer I get to the end, the more realistic the projection is, the harder the hurdle is. The more realistic the projection is, the more difficult the checkpoint will be. Luo Fan let out a long sigh and thought so. All the planets in this galaxy had an extremely close connection with the Era whirlpool. The Era Bridge relied on this close connection to distribute the shocking space-time distortion around the Era whirlpool to the 9,999 planets. After that, It relied on constantly crossing these planets to overcome the space-time distortion and gradually moved towards the Arrow whirlpool so that the extremely strong space-time distortion would not affect the challengers. The reality of the Arrow bridge only appeared for a few breaths before completely disappearing. Luo Fan returned to the projection of the Primordial era and returned to the side of the shadow of the saint within the formation. At some point, the incredibly complicated and mysterious strange pattern that he had constructed with his thoughts had collapsed and disappeared, turning into nothingness as if it had never appeared. Luo Fan was not surprised by this at all, nor did he feel any heartache. This was because he knew that this was inevitable. Previously, the pattern had given him that extraordinary perspective for a few dozen breaths, but its power had already been exhausted. It was only natural for it to collapse and disappear. However, to him, the meaning of the existence of the pattern was already extraordinary. Even if it disappeared, it would not be a big deal. At this moment, he felt that the barrier between the perfect void comprehension and the Tao integration realm was already extremely fragile. With a slight thought, the layer of barrier suddenly shattered. His spirit, his senses, his spirit, his mind, his willpower, his body, and his power all ascended in an instant. In the blink of an eye, they had risen to a level that was several times higher than before. They had all reached the level of the Tao integration realm. Evidently, with just a thought, he had achieved the breakthrough that he had worked hard for a long time and even expected to take tens of thousands of years to achieve. He had become a true Tao integration stage cultivator who had not been forced to do so in the slightest. The moment he became a Tao integration realm expert, the world in his eyes instantly underwent an earth-shattering change. After the entire universe reached nothingness, another layer of even more mysterious existence appeared. This kind of existence was extremely mysterious. It had no size or range and seemed to fill the entire universe in his eyes. However, it also seemed so insignificant that it could be ignored. When he saw this mysterious existence, Luo Fan suddenly had a feeling that he had become one with the great Tao. Everything in the universe appeared directly in front of him at this moment. In this projection of the Primordial era, the locations of the existences in the intermediate stage of the Sage-to-Be, their power, and even the cultivation methods they cultivated, everything appeared in front of him in great detail. A feeling of being able to do whatever he wanted to them arose from the bottom of his heart. As soon as this feeling appeared, Luo Fan did not hesitate. He raised his hand and grabbed at the void. Billions of light years away, a being at the intermediate stage of the Sage-to-Be, which was equivalent to the pinnacle of the Tao integration realm, suddenly shuddered. He suddenly let out an angry roar, and the power within his body burst forth. Two cultivators with different auras, but identical power, also appeared beside him. They also burst forth with power, as if they were helping him resist something. However, in just an instant, they exploded with a loud bang. Together with the cave abode and the planet they lived in, they were directly turned into a huge shockwave that swept across a radius of dozens of light minutes. In the end, they were directly turned into powder and directly dissipated in the void with a cosmic wind. A being at the intermediate stage of the Sage-to-Be, who had already slain two corpses and was equivalent to the pinnacle of the Tao integration realm, was instantly crushed into dust by Luo Fan from billions of light years away. Even someone as composed as Luo Fan could not help but smile faintly. As expected, a projection is just a projection. No matter how powerful one is and how powerful one's cultivation base is, there will always be a fatal weakness. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Welcome. Your support is my greatest motivation. For the latest and fastest chapters, please visit Reading is a Pleasure. I suggest you bookmark it.